Once upon a time, there was a man whom the world called a saint. However, in spite of all his endless good deeds, his suffering seemed to have no end, because in the past he had committed a terrible sin. And then one day, he turned to God with a prayer. The man cried and begged God to bring his loved one back to life. In mercy, God turned back the hands of time, giving the man the opportunity to atone for his sins. The guy was shocked to think that he had never dreamed of getting a second chance. He had only heard of such things in legends. He had once been a lord in the South, but after making a terrible decision, he had fallen into a life of vagrancy. He survived until he met a saint and went back in time to try to change his own regretful future. The plate of food fell to the ground and broke. Meanwhile, the protagonist, Lu Zong, was pinned to the table by a man hovering over him. The man hovering overhead spoke politely to Lu Zong, but said that he was trying to be patient, despite the need to end him immediately. He then asked if Lu Zong was willing to cooperate. That's how Lu Zong united with Carlton, the curse of all nobles. The boy wondered how this was possible. They were sailing on a ship. In his cabin, Lu Zong was lying on the bed and Carlton was hovering over him. They kissed passionately, and Carlton also massaged the boy's ear. They barely broke the kiss and caught their breath. Carlton turned to his lordship and asked why he did not push him away. Lu Zong said that perhaps it was because he had no dislike for Carlton. Then the brunette smiled and unbuttoned his shirt, saying that in that case he wouldn't mind. The boy looked at him with reddened cheeks and thought about how it was that he and this man now had such a relationship. The boy pulled off the man's shirt, and the man put his hand on his buttock and gently kissed his neck. The man pulled up His Majesty's shirt and put his hand on his stomach. He whispered directly into his neck that he wanted the only name that night to come out of his mouth to be his name, not the saint's. The men stood by the fountain. Lu Zong thanked Carlton. He stood behind him and asked why. Then His Majesty turned to him and smilingly said that for everything he had done, he wondered in his mind if he could correct the mistakes of his past and reunite with the saint. Some men were kicking another man. There were 3 of them, 2 were beating him, and the 3rd was sitting on his haunches watching. One of them exhaled and said that the man was a tough bastard because he didn't make sound. One flipped a coin and said it was boring and they should go play cards. Then the one who had previously called the guy a freak said that he was not bad looking and his hair was golden. The man mockingly told him to leave him alone because he was just a dirty beggar, and the other man replied that he was right. Meanwhile, the boy was lying on the cold stone curled up in a ball. The mutilated guy said that they wouldn't even be able to look into the eyes of his former self. He sat down, held bread in his hand, and smiled with an exhalation and said that they were being too picky. Then he smiled at the bread and took a bite. He thanked God that he had something to eat this week. He had never known hunger or pain in his entire life, because he had been given all of this from birth. Because he was the only son of the Duke of Anne's, the Lord of the South, and his mother, a princess. Since he had inherited the Duchy of Anne's, all the lands of the vast southern region belonged to him. He had only the best and most exquisite things. There was nothing he could not get. When the butler said that he had to be responsible like a duke, the man would say that he still had work to do. Lu Zong would smile and say that he was leaving it to him. He said that after all, they were all dedicated workers and they were much better at it. At the time, he did not realize how valuable people are. Thinking back to the ball and the food that was served there, he thought that it took a lot of effort to prepare the delicacies, which he only tasted, leaving a pile of leftovers. Remembering this, he realized what he used to be like. Then he threw the bread away and said that it was just a poor piece of bread. For a while, he just looked at the bread lying on the ground, and then he moved over and picked it up. Tears began to fall on the bread. Then he thought that now he would lick the whole plate clean without complaint. He wondered how it had come to this. 3 years ago, when the king fell ill, he left 2 sons to compete for the throne. The first prince, Elian, was the son of a mistress, but his character and knowledge were impeccable. The second prince, Ferris, had both legitimacy as he was the son of the king and the support of influential nobles. Legitimacy is the legitimacy of someone's power. Unfortunately, as each of them fought for their right to inherit, war broke out. And soon the whole kingdom joined in, dividing into 2 factions. Then Lu Zong also had to make his choice. He placed his bet on the second prince. Lu Zong thought that Ferris was of the same noble blood, and he was his only friend. He thought he was safe with him, but that was until one moment. Ferris was killed in battle, and the first prince took power into his own hands. Lu Zong walked holding the wall and looked at the starry sky. He recalled that it was because the first prince had become the ruler that he had fled, leaving behind the people and territory he was supposed to protect. When he lost his status as Duke of Aniski, the world became cold, full of prohibitions. Then he became a nobody. He was walking down the street and found a garbage can and was looking for something to take from it. He felt a strong blow and found himself on the ground. He thought that he had become an ordinary coward who had run away from reality. Tears were streaming from his eyes, and he thought about how he had only known he would die like this. He turned his gaze to the man in the road who stood silently beside him. Behind the man, he could see people who were important to him. He thought that he would never have escaped. Then the man threw him over his shoulder and carried him outside the gate. Luzon's eyes remained open for a while, but they could not stay open much longer. He exhaled the last of the air from his lungs and his body went limp. Luzon woke up abruptly with a frightened look on his face. Someone was calling for His Majesty, and someone was ordering him to kill everyone who dared to leave the castle without exception. Luzon did not understand what was happening and only asked what it was and whether he was in hell. A guy named Ruger put his suitcase on the ground with a loud sound. He agreed with Luzon, saying that he thought he could call it hell. Then the blond man turned to the guy by name in surprise. Frightened, Luzon pointed his finger at Ruger and said that he too had been caught and killed by Carlton soldiers on the day they escaped. He said he was sure of it. Then Ruger asked again and said that, in that case, Luzon could just curse him to death for that matter. Then Luzon said that's not what he meant. When he turned his head, he saw his reflection in the mirror. He began to touch his face in surprise, asking why it was so clean. He thought it was a delusion and he needed to come to his senses. He took both his hands to the sides a few centimeters from his cheeks and then hit them hard with his palms. When he felt the pain, he immediately lowered his head and screamed. Then an excited Ruger said there was no time for that. They had to hurry up and get out of there before it was too late. Luzon raised his head slightly and looked at the boy. His cheek was completely red and a tear had gathered in the corner of his eye. He asked where they needed to go. Ruger turned his head to him with a surprised look and asked again without understanding. Ruger was standing with a bag on his back, and there were also bags and a suitcase next to him. Then he said that they had to leave Luzon's castle. Luzon looked at him in shock, and Ruger said that they had to hurry. Then Luzon got out of bed and opened the window. He thought that this could not be happening. There was a massacre outside, and some knight was shouting for the others to stop them and not retreat. Luzon looked at it with wide eyes and could not believe that he was back in the past. Moreover, it was the very night he ran away from Carlton. Carlton. He was born into poverty, but thanks to his impressive skill, he became known as the first prince of Border. Carlton despised people like Luzon, incompetent aristocrats who lived in luxury only because they were lucky enough to be born into a wealthy family. Carlton also received another title, Beach of the Aristocracy. A scourge is something that causes harm, disaster. When Carlton's army invaded the land of the Duchy of Luzon with the intention of forcing them to surrender, they decided to resist. But it was a battle with no chance of victory. The Viscount's son was tied to the horses and quartered. People discussed that Carlton had cut up the Baron who mocked him for his dirty blood. They said that every nobleman who incurs his wrath dies a horrible death. Lewison didn't want to die, so he decided that it was better to be branded a cowardly lord and a fugitive, but to survive. After his escape, Carlton made sure that Lewison would regret this choice for the rest of his life. He destroyed everything that belonged to Lewison. Now Lewison stood by the window thinking. He wondered what if this was the last chance to prevent a tragic future. He said that maybe there was a way to change everything. While Luzon was saying this, Rucker did not understand what was happening to him. Ruger turned around and said that Luzon should stay here and then Carlton would grab him. He took the bags of clothes and said that all Luzon's things were prepared. All they had to do was run away. He stood by the balcony, unmoved. When Ruger was about to speak to Luzon again, he immediately interrupted him with a negative answer. Ruger turned to him with a surprised look. Luzon stood in front of the others sitting at the table and said that he would not run away anymore. He said that they were from Anne's house. They had to surrender. Everyone at the table looked at Luzon in shock. One man who acted as the estate manager asked about surrendering, and then said that it seemed that Luzon's long stay in the chambers had made him forget that this war was not a game. Then an excited Luzon said he knew it well. The man then asked him if, despite all this, he was still talking about surrender and if he thought it was all a joke. The Duke then said that they, like him, knew that they did not have enough men to face Carlton, and that it was only a matter of time before their forces would capture and control the castle. Then the financial manager said that the vassals of the House of Anne's would definitely send reinforcements. Luzon shook his head in denial and said with a sigh that they would not come. The Duke explained that if they were helping, they would have sent help before Carlton raised his sword. Everyone thought about it because it was true, and the vassals would have helped in that case. Luzon looked at them and thought that after his parents died, these people had taken care of his upbringing and made his childhood peaceful. So now he could not let them give their lives for him. Lewison smiled and said that Carlton and the prince would not benefit from killing them. They only wanted them to lay down their arms, and that was that. Then his words were interrupted by a loud bang on the table. The estate manager shouted in anger, followed by a question as to whether these words were appropriate for the head of the House of Annes. The man said that Luzin was the owner of these golden fields, the ruler of the South. He said that, moreover, for the sake of honor, he could not retreat. Then the Duke stammered and said that he was making this choice for the sake of everyone. The man shouted that he had said the same thing when they insisted on supporting the second prince. He then asked where they were going with this choice. He said that Luzin probably intended to beg for his own life in such terrible circumstances, and asked why he would not take at least some responsibility for his lands. Then he stood up and told the Duke to ignore it, because it would be useless. The man said that they should decide everything on their own, as they always did. With that, everyone began to rise. When a man began to lead Luzin out, he began to shout that they should wait and that he had something else very important to say. The man behind him said that he had to leave because the Duke must be tired. He was thrown out of the door, and the man told him not to worry, that from now on adults would take care of it. The door closed in front of the Duke, and he looked at it sitting on the ground. Luzin lay in his room on the bed, first with his face in the pillow, and then turned his head and thought about what his past behavior might have caused this. Reason 1. He spent the duchy's treasury on extravagant things and satisfying his own needs. 2. He left everything to his subordinates and fled. There were 3,456,789 reasons, and many more. Crying in bed, he said that he would have said the same thing in their place. An agitated Ruger stood with his bag and said that there was no time for this. Ruger said that Carlton's army could seize the castle at any time, but for some reason they were holding back. Then the boy handed the Duke a map and told him to look at it. Ruger said that he had received the map from a forester. The boy smiled and said that it would allow them to avoid the monsters and safely reach the lands of Dabbled. Then Luzin turned to Roger and asked what would happen when they got there. Suddenly the Duke stood up and snatched the map from his hands and told him to wait. Luzin looked at the map and said that it meant that to the left of the road was Dabbled's territory, but to the right was Carlton's garrison. Ruger confirmed this with a smile and said that was why they would not see a hair of Carlton's men. Luzin suddenly shouted, "Let's go," and said they were leaving immediately. Ruger was surprised by the suddenness, but after he recovered, he began to take the things he had previously packed. While the Duke continued to look at the map, Ruger said that it was a great idea and that Doublet would give them the best protection and best conditions. Ruger said that Carlton would not be able to pursue them on the Count's land. Luzin smiled and thought that if he could not send an official letter, he would go there himself. Ruger and Luzin were walking through a dark forest. The Duke was holding a torch and looking at the map. Ruger kept asking the boy if he was sure this was the right way, because it seemed to him that the forest was getting thicker and thicker. Ruger asked the Duke what had made him suddenly play the tour guide. Luzin was smiling awkwardly as he walked ahead, and mentally apologizing to Ruger for such a blatant lie. He was serious about saving him this time. Then he heard some sounds, and the Duke got a little scared. He mentally forced himself to pull himself together, because this was just an ordinary gloomy forest, not the past haunted by illusions. Luzin saw a knight standing behind him. He swung his sword, and the Duke squeezed his eyes shut in denial. He assured himself that the Knights of Death were nothing but a delusion. While his body was enveloped in a dark aura, he mentally told himself that the saint had given him the strength to overcome them. Then at one point he shouted out loud in his mind, "No." Luzin opened his eyes sharply when he heard Ruger calling him. The boy asked why he stopped so abruptly. The Duke was smiling awkwardly and wanted to say something, but the words didn't come out. Suddenly he started scratching his head and said that he hadn't walked that far in a long time, so he was tired. Then Ruger exhaled and looked at Luzin and said that he thought so, because he had rushed forward on his own out of excitement. Luzin looked seriously in front of him and put his hand to his chest and thought that this was not the horrible future. He noted that he had returned to this world again. Suddenly, Ruger snatched the map from the Duke's hands and told him exactly why he wanted him to give it back. Looking at the map, he said that if they continued on this road, they would run straight into Carlton's army. Luzin stood silently, looking straight ahead. Then Ruger looked at the Duke with a serious look. Meanwhile, Luzin wanted to pretend that he did not understand, but it was no use. Ruger took hold of his head and said that he suspected something was wrong, and then asked if the Duke really wanted to surrender to Carlton, provided that he would spare his life. Then the angry Ruger looked at the Duke and mentally called him a rustler. A rustler is the same as a dumbass, dismissively. Meanwhile, Luzin looked insultingly in the other direction. Ruger came over and grabbed Luzin by the shoulders and angrily asked him if he was crazy. The latter frightenedly asked Ruger to wait and said that he was speaking too loudly. And then goblins came out of the forest and attracted the boy's attention. Luzin asked them frightened what they should do. Then Ruger resolutely stepped forward and pulled out his sword and said that he would clear the way and run as soon as the Duke saw the exit. Ruger abruptly jumped up and ran to meet the goblin. He swung at the monster with a scream and cut off its head. When the goblin fell to the ground, Rooter looked at Luzin and shouted for him to run right away. As the boy instructed him, the Duke took off running. But before the Duke could run away, he heard the goblin's loud scream. When Luzin looked up, he saw the body of the monster flying straight at him with its sharp clawed hand raised. Suddenly, Rooter loudly called out to the Duke as he resisted another goblin. Luzin had time to react and jumped away, noticing that the goblin's hand had passed him by. The boy was catching his breath, sitting on the ground when the monster suddenly growled and raised a branch covered in blood. Luzin covered his head with his hands and squeezed his eyes, mentally denying that he could not die like that. And then, fortunately for him, the goblin did not have time to hit him, because his head was pierced by a spear. When the Duke opened his eyes, he looked at the spear that had pierced the goblin's head. He looked at it and wondered who the hell had done it. But then he heard the sound of hooves and turned his head to see Carlton riding a black stallion. He looked at the boy and asked who they had here if it wasn't Louis Anne's. When Luzin wanted to address Carlton, he interrupted him and said that he did not expect to see a nobleman like him in this place. Carlton spoke of Luzin as someone who comes out of the shadows like a rat and runs away from debt collectors at night. Luisin's hand moved a little and he said that he had something to say. Then Carlton smiled and said that he was heading straight for his grave. Then he grabbed the boy and threw him behind him on his horse. Rooter shouted out to the Duke. Then 2 knights grabbed him, and he resisted, shouting for them to take their hands off him, and asked Carlton where he was going with the Duke. The man did not answer, but simply ordered the knights to move, and then the Duke mentally shouted in denial to wait. The Duke landed painfully on the ground and cried out. As he sat up, he thought about how he almost threw up and had a feeling that all his consumption, accumulated over decades, was trying to come out. Then Carlton turned to the knights who were holding Rooter and ordered them to lock him up somewhere. Rooter, with tears in his eyes, angrily broke free and tried to say something, but he could not because of the bandage on his mouth. Luzin, crying, mentally asked him to trust him and he would come for him soon. When the Duke looked around, he realized that this place was Carlton's garrison. He looked at the people around him and thought that they were too neat for mercenaries and too free to be knights or soldiers. When 2 of these men looked at Luzin, they started laughing, saying that they were prey that Carlton had caught. Then Luzin realized that they were definitely Carlton's subordinates. Then Carlton said in a cold voice that they should watch their language because the Duke was among them. Everyone started laughing, pointing fingers at Luzin and saying that his situation was not good. The Duke sat there with a look on his face that made it clear that he was clearly pissed off. Luzin stood up holding a stick and mentally saying that he could not afford to give up. He looked at Carlton and thought that in battle it was important to get ahead of your enemy. Then he said that he was the son of Robert and Tana Ains, the Duke of the Golden Slopes. And then he got down on one knee and held out a white flag and smiled. Those who had been laughing before now looked at him in shock. He smiled at Carlton and said that he was offering him his surrender. Everyone around him stood silently, and Carlton did not even raise an eyebrow. Then the Duke closed his eyes thinking that he must be surprised. Then he heard laughter. When the Duke opened his eyes and looked at Carlton in surprise, he asked him, laughing, if this meant that he had come to surrender. Without waiting for an answer, Carlton covered his mouth with laughter and said that if he was so interested in saving his own life, he should have opened the gates of his castle before the first death of his soldier. In a moment, his face became stern and his voice cold. Pulling out his sword, he said that this was the reason he despised aristocrats like him. Carlton said they were scoundrels who did not care about the lives of others. Luzin looked down at Carlton, frightened, and stammered to tell him to wait. He was scared and thinking that this was not going to go according to plan. Meanwhile, Carlton was already swinging his sword at him. The man said that when they start wars, they must take responsibility for them and turn to the Duke. He cut Luzin's face a little with a sharp blade. Then the Duke forced himself to take all his will into his fist. As the blood dripped, he mentally told himself to think. Then the Duke shouted at him to wait a minute. The boy said that if he killed him, he would die himself. He said that he was sent here by the first prince to test him. In the future, when Prince Elion took the throne and established his power, Carlton was the first to be destroyed because of his disdain for the aristocracy. There was not even a chance that the nobility would recognize a knight of lower birth with the nickname Scourge of the Aristocracy. He had nothing but a terrible end. Luzin thought that although there were rumors that he had escaped before his execution and become a mercenary or found himself in religion. The Duke clutched the flag tighter and said that he may not have support, but Carlton was surrounded by enemies. He said that Prince Elion probably wanted to make sure that he was someone who was trustworthy and able to carry out his orders no matter what. Carlton said that the prince had never punished him for killing an aristocrat. Lewison said that this war would soon be over. He told Carlton to think of himself as a king who had to choose between an aristocrat who could give him wealth and loyalty and a dog who had already played his part. He asked who he would choose. The Duke said that they had not captured his castle, although they were capable of doing so at any moment. He asked why and if it was possible, because he understood his precarious position. The last words reached the limit of Carlton's anger. The man abruptly withdrew his sword and Luzen fell to the ground. Then Carlton forcefully stabbed the sword into the ground next to the Duke's head and sat over him with his knee on the ground. Then he addressed the Duke by name and said that he was shortening his rather short life. Carlton stood with his foot on the Duke's shoulder. Then Luzen said that if he did not believe him, he should cut off his head right away, because next year Carlton's head would hang on the walls of the palace. Then Carlton pulled out his sword and threw it back. He got up from Luzen and held his head, while the boy rubbed his shoulder with his hand, which was aching with pain. Then Carlton told them to do it again. Luzen asked what he meant. Then Carlton walked over to the boy, picked him up and gave him the flag and stood in front of him. The Duke did not understand at first, and then smiled and put his other hand to his chest and asked if it was like that again. The men who were sitting around the table in the study when the Duke spoke about his decisions were now discussing the fact that the enemy had stopped the offensive and this was their chance. The head of finance said that this was out of the question, because they only had the strength of the castle. Then the man who played the Duke from the office asked if he wanted to just sit back and do nothing. The other man objected and said that he was only warning them to be careful. The estate manager listened to all this. Then a frightened young man burst into the room, and behind him, holding his head, stood a terrified maid. He shouted to the manager and started saying something about the outside. When the estate manager came outside, he boiled with anger. Carlton stood in front of him, with Luzen on horseback, Reuter a little behind him, who covered his face with his hand, and many of his subordinates behind them. The Duke said, smiling shyly, that it was just the way things were. Then the manager began to foam at the mouth, and the embarrassed young man and the maid, frightened by what they had seen, tried to help him. Carlton was walking down the hall with a subordinate. The subordinate said that because of the unexpected surrender, he had expected a trap, but it seemed to be the reality. He said he never thought they would do it so easily. The boy told Carlton that it seemed that the Duke's subordinates had no idea that he intended to surrender to them. Carlton just walked along listening to this, but did not say a word. Carlton recalled passing a room with an open door and hearing voices coming from it. When he looked through the open door, he saw a woman and a man. She was saying that the prince's victory was inevitable, so there was no point in quarreling. The woman said that the current priority was to eliminate this threat on their side. The man then said that they did not need a person who was dangerous to them. He asked how they would know when that yard dog would come back and bite the hand that was feeding it. Then the prince, accompanied by aristocrats, sent Carlton to the south. He smilingly ordered him to go and conquer the Duchy of Venice. Carlton scratched the back of his head and thought that things had only gotten worse. He didn't even think that the prince would immediately put a spoke in the wheel. The subordinate looked to the side, and when he started to speak, Carlton also turned his gaze there. They were looking at the Duke, and the subordinate said that they were saying that he was nothing but a bore and a vain talker, but he looked as if he were really noble. Meanwhile, Luzen walked with his eyes blankly on the ground. Then Carlton said that they would soon find out the truth. The bearded man who had thrown him out of the office came out in front of the Duke. He said that the manager said that he had nothing to say to Luzen. He said that this was a big blow to everyone's pride and that the manager didn't know how to respond. Luzen recalled how the manager hit the table and asked him how he was so sure that Prince Elian would not destroy them all. He said that they had once been considered a great family to whom even the emperor could not be disrespectful. And then he asked why they were so low now and said that now they had to wait for orders from some mercenary. He said he was disappointed in the Duke. The Duke exhaled and said that this was to be expected of him. The butler then held the Duke's hands and said that in time he would understand his choice. Luzen thanked him for these words. The boy thought about the fact that no one believed in him and it hurt him, but he could not help it. He confidently looked straight ahead and mentally said that he had made his choice. Then he turned his head to the window and smiled. Outside the window, he could see many golden ears of grain. The boy thought that he had prevented the night he regretted the most and protected this shining golden seed by himself. A man and a woman were picking ears of grain. The man asked her if she had heard that the Duke had surrendered. He said that he hadn't fought, and the man didn't even think he would win. The woman said that the blue flag flying over the Duke's castle was proof that this war would soon be over. They wondered what would happen to House Anne's and the rest of the South. They believed that something terrible was happening and wondered if Carlton was in command, remembering that he was called the scourge of the aristocracy, scourge replacing bitch. They felt sorry for the Duke. Reuter brought the food to the Duke's chambers and, upon entering, turned to him, attracting his attention. Luzin was sitting on the edge of the bed, and when Ruger spoke, he turned his head slightly in his direction. The Duke was lucky to survive, but he was in a terrible situation. The Duke put the food in his mouth, while Ruger looked at him carefully. After he'd chewed a little, he smiled with tears in his eyes. Luzin thought about how delicious it was, and he mentally told himself that he knew he should have given up. Luzin broke the bread Ruger had brought him, and having spread something on it, took a bite. The Duke made satisfied noises from how delicious it was, and tears appeared in the corners of his eyes. Ruger watched, not understanding what was happening, and wondered how the Duke could eat with such pleasure, since he used to take a little bite and order the table cleared when there was too much food left. Ruger did not understand how a person who only tasted sumptuous dishes prepared by the head chef could enjoy such simple food. Then Ruger looked at the Duke, thinking that he did not look like the man he had served for so long. He continued to scrutinize Luzin, who was sitting in front of him. Luzin said something with a smile and puffy cheeks, but it was hard to understand. To translate, he asked Ruger what was wrong and whether he had anything to say. Then the guy answered in the negative and said that the Duke should enjoy his meal. Luzin just hummed in response. After eating, the Duke flopped down on the bed. Then Ruger, while cleaning up, spoke about Luzin's previous request. The Duke quickly got up and asked if he had found him. Ruger denied it and said that he didn't know who he was looking for, but that it was a bit difficult to do so at the moment. The guy said that Carlton had taken over the castle, so he was unable to do anything. When Luzin heard this, he exhaled a sigh of relief. Ruger then asked who he wanted to find and said that he didn't believe there was anyone he knew that he didn't know. Then, after some thought, the Duke said that there was a savior, a saint. Luzin, remembering the day he let the last of his air out of his chest, wondered who he was. Memories. The fire was crackling in the fireplace. Lying in bed, the Duke opened his eyes and turned his head and then saw the saint. He said that he had saved him and shared food and a place to rest. Luzin asked what he should call the savior. The man was silent for a while, and after scooping up the soup with a spoon, he said that others called him the one-armed pilgrim. That is how the saint saved Luzin, but he could not survive. Luzin lost a lot of weight and barely spoke to the saint and said that he was afraid that he would meet people in paradise who had lost their lives because of him. Every word was very difficult. He asked how he should apologize. Luzin's eyes welled up, and his face twisted with the grief and pain that overwhelmed him. Then he took his hand and called him brother. The last thing Luzin managed to say was words of gratitude to the saint. At the time, he thought he would probably never see him again. Now the Duke was sitting with his knees drawn up and thinking about the fact that they had only been together for a year. He thought that this illness was the end of him. He buried his face in his knees and thought that he really owed the saint a return to the past. Luzin tried to hold back his tears, thinking that the opportunity to change the future was the saint's merit. The boy mentally promised him that he would repay his kindness and bring him here to the estate. Ruger put the tea down next to Luzin and told him that they would be given freedom as soon as the issue of war reparations was resolved. Luzin smiled and said that was exactly right. He wanted to say something else, but did not have time. One of Carlton's subordinates entered the room and said that he had been ordered to bring the Duke. Ruger then angrily asked if his lordship should not have time for a meal. The Duke then told Ruger to leave. Lowison said that he had to respond immediately to any invitation. Otherwise, they did not know what Carlton would do. The Duke entered the office, and a subordinate told the commander that Luzin had arrived. Meanwhile, Carlton was carefully writing something down on paper. He did not take his eyes off the paper and asked if Luzin was uncomfortable being here. The Duke was angry and said that he had just rolled his eyes. Then the commander stood up and said that nothing had happened until now and that the Duke had given him his authority and would appear as soon as he was called. The man smiled and leaned over Luzin and said that he could see that he needed advice from the great Duke. He then asked him to be understanding. Carlton began to advance on the Duke, and the latter retreated in fear. Then the commander said that in the end he was just a miserable commoner. He asked the Duke why he was moving away from him. When Luzin stopped, Carlton leaned his head right up to his ear and whispered that he looked as if he were not at all sure of himself. The Duke looked straight ahead with a cold gaze and thought that Carlton was a cunning bastard. He thought about what would have happened differently that day. 1 week ago, the day of surrender. Carlton's banquet in honor of the victory. His subordinates celebrated, drank, and shouted to victory. Cheers? Cheers. They were having as much fun as they could because they had been waiting for this day. The maid looked disgustedly at her subordinates, calling them mercenaries and vagrants. Another maid asked how their house had turned into this. Then the first one said that from now on they were waiting for the invaders. Then the maid asked who was to blame. Carlton was coming down the stairs, and the Duke was walking beside him. Lewison smiled falsely and thought that he had agreed to come to show his heart. When the commander asked him if he wanted to attend the banquet, he immediately agreed. He almost cried thinking about how unbearably embarrassed he was. Then Carlton said with a smile that this castle really lived up to its reputation. He said that it must be quite exhausting to keep a place like this. Then the Duke thought that Carlton had been treating him with disdain all along. He wondered in his mind why the commander was pretending to be polite now and if he was planning something. Carlton then said that it might not be enough, but they had put their hearts and souls into the preparations. When Luzin looked at the table with a lot of food, he opened his mouth in surprise. He was holding his fork and knife with reddened cheeks, thinking that Carlton was good. Then the commander smilingly told him to eat and drink to his heart's content. Luzin immediately started to eat the meat and grabbed it on both sides with his hands. He thought about what they say, that a person who offers you delicious food cannot be bad. After chewing a bit, he washed it down. He banged his mug on the table and looked up to think that it was undeniably true. He was smiling as he wiped his mouth of the alcohol residue, and his face was very red from intoxication. As the Duke stood with a glass in his hand, Carlton, holding a bottle behind him, offered to fill Luzin's glass. He responded in a heady voice, thinking that he had never dreamed of sharing a meal with Carlton. He smiled as he thought that he had really done something incredible. He remembered getting sick and dying, then going back in time, changing the future. And despite all this, he turned the terrifying Carlton into a cute lamb. The Duke thought that it turned out that there was nothing special about the commander. Suddenly, Carlton's gaze changed. Luzin could only wonder, as the man took him by the shirt and pushed his back against the table and hovered over him. Luzin's whole body began to shake with pain and fear. Carlton then called Luzin his Duke and said that he was trying to hold back because the banquet was not easy to organize. He asked why he shouldn't play along. The commander looked at him with a crazed look and said that even though he looked like a simpleton in the Duke's opinion, he would not be able to resist if he saw even a drop of smugness on his face. He leaned into Luzin's ear and told him to be afraid, and then called him a little Duke. Here, Carlton used the first name you to the Duke to demonstrate his disdain. The Duke lay there feeling all the eyes of his subordinates on him, and Carlton continued to speak. The man said that, of course, if he wanted peace, no matter how short-lived it might be. Luzin thought that this cursed man was as hard to deceive as a demon. Now he was smiling and asking what it was this time. Carlton looked at the map and said that he had heard that there were weapons stockpiles in the northern warehouse, but he could not determine its location from the map. He said that the Duke would have to help him. Shocked, Luzin said loudly that there were more than 5 warehouses in the north. The commander smiled and said that in that case he would have to do his best. Then the Duke said that his back still hurt from the sacks of provisions he had carried yesterday from the southern warehouses. Then Carlton said, smiling, that if only the servants were healthy. The subordinates said they didn't care and threw Luzin out the door and slammed it shut. On the door it was written that the Duke was forbidden to enter. Carlton's servants went on strike, faking illness. The Duke was very angry and thought that the commander always poured salt in his wound. When Luzin asked about the warehouse key, Carlton threw up his hands and asked how he would know about the warehouse key in someone else's castle. He said that he was sure the Duke would be able to handle it and asked him to do his best. The Duke read through a lot of books and wondered why. When his brain was boiling over and a book fell on his head, he screamed and asked why this damn place was so huge. He angrily asked where the key was, flipping through the book. He read on a piece of paper that was enclosed in the book that the key was with the butler, and in any case, it was in the butler's office. Luzin scratched his head thinking that this was difficult. Then he thought about the fact that the commander had never trusted him with a complicated or important matter anyway. The Duke thought that if Carlton really wanted to, he could really kick that door in. Luzin thought it was just a complicated job that had no point. Then he slammed the book shut and decided that he should get Carlton out as soon as possible or find a saint. As he walked down the corridor, Luzin heard servants whispering behind him that the young Duke had passed and asked if he was not being held here. Then the maid said that the Duke fulfills Carlton's every whim. He stood holding the door handle, his eyes downcast. Meanwhile, the servants were discussing how the very thought of this hurt their pride. They did not understand how someone like him could have such a high title. When the Duke abruptly entered the room, he smiled. He thought about the fact that they had not thrown him out or stoned him, but had only giggled and discussed him heatedly. He was happy because he was completely unharmed. Opening the cabinets, the Duke found a key and a book. He thought that if Carlton had the Book of Northern Syllables, he could get rid of him. Looking at the book, he said that it was a new tool for irrigation that had broken through, and this flame of the Holy Spirit is really impressive. Then the Duke came to some kind of understanding. He said that it was only early fall, and then he began to remember when the harvest time would come. Then he exclaimed in fright that they would be here soon. It happened the same year that Carlton left the duchy, turning it into ruins. They appeared over the desolate, half-naked fields as if in a nightmare. Endless swarms of locusts. In the grain-rich south, Locusts are not just insects. They are plague demons that have come from hell to devour every precious grain they can get their hands on. At that time, the South was already in crisis, caused by Carlton and his orders for fires and pogroms. So, preserving food was a direct way to survive, but the locusts destroyed the last hope for life. Now, flipping through the book, Luzin thought that this time he had surrendered to Carlton, so the duchy had only come under occupation, so it was not an urgent issue. Moreover, the South has a secret weapon. The name itself dazzles, the flame of the Holy Spirit. It is a precious treasure of the South, an object imbued with colossal magic. The one that allows you to burn only locusts, leaving the grain unharmed. Then the Duke thought that now he had to find the right way to convey this information to Carlton. Lewison thought for a long time about what to do. Suddenly he smiled slyly and remembered that the saint had told him what to do in such a situation. The saint had told him not to waste his energy, but to go straight to the smartest person. The Duke knocked on the door, but no one answered or opened it. He leaned his body against the door, pleading with the butler, saying that it was him. Suddenly, he quickly and clearly said that a terrible swarm of locusts was on its way and asked what they should do. He heard the sound of someone approaching, and Luzin smiled. The man immediately opened the door and asked about the swarm of locusts and what happened to those bastards from hell, breathlessly and frightened. Then the Duke looked at the treasurer in disappointment and asked what he was doing here and where the butler had gone. Treasurer obsolete is a person in charge of finances. The man replied that he was taking care of him because he had fallen ill due to stress and overwork. Then the treasurer told him to get back to the main topic. The estates along the Locust Path send them warnings every year, but they hadn't heard from them yet. Then the Duke said that there was a civil war this year, so it was dangerous for them to send warnings. The man thought about it and said that it was possible. Then the treasurer thought that even the butler, who had real power in the duchy, had not heard anything about those vile creatures. He wondered in his mind why his lordship was suddenly reporting locusts. The man said that in any case, preparation is not a problem. One message for each house is enough, because they have experience with this. He wanted to say something else, but Luzin interrupted him. The Duke said that Carlton had fortified the outer borders of the castle, so it was impossible to contact them. The excited treasurer then said that he had just remembered that they usually receive messages from Baron Lorraine. But he invited Carlton to dinner and then kept him waiting for half a day. They say Carlton tore him apart with ropes. When the treasurer said this, Luzin remembered the key. He realized that he was now keeping Carlton waiting and could face the same consequences as Baron Lorraine. Then he said he had to run and thanked the treasurer. The Duke ran away as fast as he could. The treasurer returned to the room in embarrassment, while the dust only kicked up after the Duke's speed. He thought that the day had finally come when his lordship decided to do something on his own. He thought that maybe the crisis really does change people. Carlton looked at the papers, and then turning to the window, which was already dark, he clutched the paper and said mentally, "The damned house of Ains." He turned around and looked at the framed photo of the Duke, and thought that his job was to get back to the capital as soon as possible, but it was taking too long to gather supplies. The man was mentally saying the Duke's name. He was mentally asking him how he could be so incompetent as to force all of his subordinates to go on strike in a time of crisis. He wondered why now, and whether it was because of a sense of danger to his own position, that he was listening to all of Luzin's arguments. Then he calmly asked aloud if there was anything to look forward to. Then the Duke abruptly burst into the office and shouted at Carlton. The commander closed his eyes and thought that he had immediately made him regret those thoughts. The man smiled and said, "Wow, look who's here." Carlton said that he had waited so long that he thought the Duke had forgotten his promise to such a scourge as he was, and the Duke laughed excitedly and objected, saying that it was impossible for him to forget his promise. Then he coughed and walked over to Carlton with his hands behind his back. Luzin said he had come up with a great plan that he wanted to share with Carlton. The commander continued to look seriously, and the Duke thought that the man should try to open up at least a little. Luzin began to smile and talk about the possibility of forcing all the northern lords to surrender. Then Carlton closed his eyes and asked if he could not simply destroy them all. Then the excited Duke said that he knew, of course, about the strength of his soldiers. There was a way to make the lords surrender. The Duke leaned down in front of Carlton and smilingly put his hand on his arm and began to say something. Carlton stopped hearing anything because he was overwhelmed by surprise. His eyes were rounded and he did not move for some time in shock. When he recovered, he sharply pushed his hand away and asked him loudly what he was doing. Luzin smiled excitedly and put his hands in front of him, convincing him that he was not involved in anything but was simply explaining his idea. The Duke was smiling very sweetly and his cheeks added even more charm. The commander looked at him in shock for a few more seconds and then turned away and waved his finger to continue. Then Luzin got close to his ear and said that what he could do was send out a message about the approaching locusts. When he asked again, the Duke moved away and enthusiastically confirmed it, and the commander silently lowered his head and covered his face with his hand. Carlton looked at him angrily and asked if he was joking. He stood up and said in a cold tone that the Duke had clearly demonstrated his contempt for him. When Luzin wanted to justify himself, the commander did not let him speak. He said that no matter how long it took him, he would deal with the surrender of the lords on his own. Carlton turned around and waved his hand and asked the Duke to leave, because he had to train. An agitated Luzin told him to wait and noted that perhaps the commander was not very familiar with it. Carlton grew even more stern on the outside. He thought about the fact that the Duke continued to say these humiliating things. He thought that he must have been patient for too long. At this point, Luzin said that this was not an easy matter. He put his hand on Carl's and said that a swarm of locusts is a matter of life and death for the lands and the lords who control them. It will make no sense for the lords to fight Carlton for power while they prepare to fight the locusts. If they don't put up a good fight, they will end up empty-handed this winter. Then the Duke loudly exclaimed that countless people would starve. He mentally told himself that he did not want to see those horrors again. They just looked at each other for a while. Then Carlton said that it was all good, and the Duke had a smile on his face. Then the man went on to say that he could not just take his word for it. Stammering, Luzin asked what he should do then. Carlton then said that an official notice would be sent to each lord, but if at least one of them did not surrender as the Duke had said, then Luzin would join them on the battlefield. The Duke smiled falsely and said that he understood. Inside, he was very angry and mentally said that this Black Knight was trying to drag him into a battle to use him as a target for arrows. Then Carlton, scratching the back of his head, calmly said that if he did not agree, there was no other choice. The Duke immediately reacted by objecting and telling the commander to wait. Luzin stammered and said he would do it. Then Carlton said that in that case, he should write a message. The letters were sent out, and all the lords were frightened by the news. There was some chaos and confusion around. The Lord ordered everyone to get ready because they had to harden their hearts and hold on. He shouted that the time had come to bruise the sides of those damned children, so they brought the secret weapon. Someone shouted that there was nothing more important than saving their food. Another man said it was not the time to close their gates and hide. An excited young man said that they had to give Duke Anne's a second chance. Thus, the castle gates were opened and the wagons entered the territory. Carlton watched from the window. A subordinate reported that all but 3 houses had sent envoys to announce the surrender. Then the shocked commander shouted out asking if they really surrendered only because of the locusts. The man said, holding his head, that they hadn't even moved after the previous threats. He did not understand what the hell was going on now. He felt as if the South was playing a joke on him. He closed the window thinking that he had not expected events to develop as Duke Ains had said. When the commander turned to leave, the subordinate asked where he was going. Then Carlton turned his head to the guy and said that he had to check something. The Duke was lying on his bed and rejoicing, saying that everything was fine and he had not tasted freedom for a long time. Thanks to the locusts, all his subjects returned to work, leaving him alone. He smiled as he hugged his pillow and said that he had even started to worry that everything had gone wrong. When he heard a knock on the door, the Duke happily ran to open it. On the way, he thought that at such moments something always goes wrong. He opened the door and asked who it was. When the boy opened his eyes, he met Carlton's cold gaze. Then Luzin gasped in fright. Sitting at the table, the Duke smiled awkwardly and scratched the back of his head to see if everyone had given up. He thought about the fact that his servants were not here and wondered if he really needed to talk to him. Then Carlton said that not all of them. He said that the Seth, Winard, and Holgar families were still protesting and asked what he knew about them. Then the Duke realized that he knew nothing about them. As Luzin pondered, Carlton looked at him and wondered how he could know so little if he had enough knowledge to take a commander by surprise twice. In Carlton's eyes, the Duke looked innocent, so he couldn't believe the rumors about his reputation as a scoundrel that even the capital knew. He believed that these were just rumors. While Carlton was looking at the Duke, the latter also looked at him, but the commander looked gloomy. This made Luzin nervous and wondered what he had done wrong this time. Carlton said that the village next to the castle had been surprisingly quiet lately. Luzin then smiled excitedly and said that this place had always been quiet and asked laughing what was going on there. Smiling slyly, Carlton mentally told himself that he knew he was being deceived, caught off guard by such a poor fellow as the Duke. Then suddenly the door of the room opened sharply and the 2 boys unanimously addressed his lordship and commander, which attracted the men's astonished looks. Holding the door were 2 guys, Carlton's subordinate and Ruger. They were both barely breathing, probably because they had been running so fast. Then the guys shouted at the same time again from behind the walls. "A swarm of locusts is coming right at us." When the men heard this, their reactions were different. Lewison asked if it was true, smiling, and Carlton looked surprised. He turned his head toward the Duke and wondered if it was a trick to get them to surrender, and if it was possible to predict a natural disaster. They stood on the balcony watching people fight a swarm of locusts. Carlton's only thought was that it couldn't be. He could not believe that it was really a swarm of locusts. Meanwhile, with the help of special weapons, people fought against the evil that could literally take their lives. Luzin then told Carlton to look at how they were fighting fiercely for their home. Then he turned around and said with a beaming smile that it was incredible. He looked at the commander and asked if he thought so too. Carlton looked at the Duke and thought that he had exceeded all his expectations. He believed that Lewison was unpredictable at all. Then he mentally addressed Luzin and said that he wanted to know more about him, but did not say it out loud. The maids were discussing how incredible their lord was because he had made a deal with Carlton to get the other people to surrender and even stop the locust swarm. One said that apparently all his guards had returned to their posts. Then another sniffed and said it was a fluke, and he had never done anything useful before. The maid with blonde hair said after a moment's thought that she thought he had changed lately. The maid sitting next to her agreed and said that he was not even half as unbalanced as he used to be. She said that maybe he was growing up. She leaned on the mop and said that whatever the reason, the atmosphere here had definitely changed thanks to him. Then the Duke appeared next to them, looking frightening, and apologized. He scared the maids almost to death. He just walked past them with his head down and wondered what he should do. Suddenly, he heard some sounds and looked up to see Ruger talking in love with the maid. This surprised the Duke quite a bit. Then Luzin quietly came up behind him and took Ruger by the shoulders from behind and said that he was a bastard. In the same pose, Luzin asked what kind of chief assistant stood there flirting frivolously with the maid while his master was in agony. The maid quickly ran away scared. Then Ruger greeted the Duke with a sweet smile and said that the whole castle was talking about his heroism. The guy said that he thought he would bask in the success and asked if something was wrong. Then the Duke rubbed his forehead and said that he knew that all but one of the southern courts had surrendered. Ruger confirmed this by saying that all but Vinard had surrendered. Then the horrified Duke said that tomorrow Carlton would lead his men into battle against them and that Luzin should join them. The shocked Ruger then asked, shouting if the commander was really taking him into battle, and then said that Carlton must have gone mad. Then Ruger said that the Duke was a bad writer, and he said that he knew it. The Duke wanted to say something, but Ruger shouted that he was not just a bad writer, but that his writing skills were deadly. Then Luzin shut him up and said that was enough. They walked away, and Ruger said that not having any ability to sit on a horse was a matter of life and death. Suddenly he smiled and told him not to worry, because he would be there to help him through it. The Duke stood there for a while looking at Ruger indifferently, and then he smiled and told him to forget about it. As long as he stayed close to the cavalry, everything would be fine. Then, smiling falsely, Ruger thought that if the Duke could do even that, it would be a miracle. Then the commander of the knights appeared on their way and addressed the Duke. They were sitting in a room at a table, and the commander of the knights pulled out something and said that the Duke was going to war tomorrow, and Luzin confirmed it. Then the man put a box on the table, and the surprised Duke asked what it was. When Luzin opened the box, the commander said that it was an enchanted bracelet, and if he waved his hand while the bracelet was on, a magic shield would work. Then the Duke remembered how his father had once given this bracelet to a commander. Then he asked the man if his father had given it to him. Then the commander simply said that he hoped he would not have to use it, but no one knows for sure. The man looked down and said that he was sorry that he could only offer him this in the coming battle. Then the Duke looked at the bracelet and said that Luzin was the only one who was really sorry. The commander looked at the Duke silently, and then got up and said that he was probably busy preparing, so he would not take up any more of his time. He said that he would be leaving and bowed his head to say goodbye. Luzin rubbed his eyes from the tears that were gathering. He continued to look at the bracelet and thought that because of his personal decision to surrender, the sacrifices of all the noble knights who had given their lives in battle were meaningless. He exhaled a breath and said that this old supporter was principled to the very end. The Duke looked out the window at the starry sky and wondered if he had deserved his position as Duke more if things would have been different. The next day, the Duke tried to climb on his horse and told Ruger to hold on tight, and the latter smiled excitedly and said that of course he would. Luzin made a jerk, but he couldn't get his leg over, so he just laid down on his stomach on the saddle. Waving his legs, he asked Ruger to help him, and the latter exhaled in frustration, realizing that he had failed. After Ruger's help, the Duke managed to sit up and thought that at least he had managed to do that. Ruger told him to hold on tight. Then, while riding, Carlton exclaimed that it was time to see how fast these horses could go. The commander smilingly asked if there were any idiots among them who were lazy and had forgotten how to ride a horse. Then the Duke worriedly told him to wait, but Carlton did not listen to him and ordered everyone to rush forward. The Duke sat on horseback and cried, thinking that everything was as expected, and that no one was left in the courtyard except Luzin and Ruger, who could not leave him alone. The Duke imagined that when they did decide to go after the army, the Duke would not be able to handle the horse. The Duke asked himself why he ever thought he could keep up with them. He pushed his pelvis to ask what was wrong and told the horse to speed up and follow the others. Then Ruger said that there was no point and that it looked like they would have to get down from their horses and continue on foot. They were walking and Ruger held both horses by the reins beside him. Then the Duke asked Ruger if the village was always so empty and why it was so quiet. Someone was looking at them from the window, and Ruger turned to the Duke and said that he should saddle his horse. Ahead of them were many peasants who were saying that it was the Duke who had left the castle, and one man was shouting that he had a request. Then Ruger stepped forward a little in front of the Duke and loudly ordered them to step back. The peasants shouted that all their food had been taken away, that they were no longer given rations, and that they were not even allowed to leave the castle walls. They shouted and asked if they wanted to be starved to death. Luzin wondered in his mind about being tortured to death and what they were talking about. Then the Duke asked how they could take food and not give rations. Then Ruger said that there was no need to talk to these peasants. When Ruger stood in front of the Duke and waved his sword, Luzin told him to stop, because these were his people. When the villagers saw the sword, they began to say that the Duke was trying to kill his own people. He held out his hand and said that he was not trying to. Herzog shouted for Ruger to stop, but then a stone flew in his direction. The boy covered himself with his hand to protect his head. This movement triggered the shield and deflected the stone. While the peasants were holding Ruger, he called for the Duke. Luzin fell on the ground in surprise and looked at the bracelet, thinking that the bracelet he had received from the commander had just saved his life. When the Duke looked up, he realized that he knew the look in the peasants' eyes. These were hungry, angry people who surrounded him. Their fears and pain were generating violence. He thought back to the past where the same thing had happened and told himself to hurry up and get out of here. He squeezed his eyes shut and pulled his knees up to his chest, while arms were already wrapped around his body. Then suddenly he heard the sound of hooves. A strong arm caught the Duke by the waist and he flew through the air. It was Carlton, and he put Luzin on his hips and loudly ordered the villagers to move away. The commander looked at the Duke with a calm look. He was thinking that he did not know why. Although the Duke's expression made Carlton smile, he did not feel the urge to mock. When they left the village, Luzin was vomiting near a tree, and Carlton stood nearby with his horse and watched him. When the Duke turned and approached the commander, he wiped his face and said that he had saved his life. Carlton said he thought so too, although it was unintentional. Then the upset Duke recalled that they had told him that the castle had taken all their food supplies and stopped delivering rations. The stocks were seized during the war, and then after the Duke's surrender, the situation changed rapidly. Everyone forgot about these people. Luzin asked if Carlton knew about this and therefore took care of the village. The commander said he did, and then turned his head to the Duke and wondered if he really didn't know about it. When he looked at the Duke, he saw his upset face, as if he was barely holding back from crying. This surprised Carlton. Luzin held back his tears and thought that even Carlton knew about it. The Duke burst into the manager's office and went to the table where the man was sitting and put his hands on it. He was shouting that the villages were on the verge of death due to starvation. He asked why the man had not brought this to his attention. Then the manager calmly asked if he really didn't know. The Duke was surprised to hear that, and the manager said that it was you who had misused their resources to support the second prince. The man said that he had signed the transfer document with his own hand. The Duke recalled signing the document, saying that he did not really understand what it said, and that he did not care. All he had to do was sign it. Indifferently throwing the document away, he thought that he could now return to his rest. Now he was mentally asking himself what he had been so preoccupied with back then. He thought about the fact that he had barely managed to save his own life, and after that he had only celebrated, completely forgetting about everything else. He covered his face with his hand. The manager said that now, one way or another, nothing could be changed, and that Sir Carlton had all the power now. The Duke continued to cover his face, which was contorted in pain. Then the Duke remembered what the saint had said to him. Brother, if you are afraid of the dark, do not hide under a blanket. Instead, light a light. If you look away and become afraid of your fears, they will grow until their weight breaks. Then Luzin clenched his fist and thought that the saint was right. He put his fist to his heart, thinking that he could not just hide. These lush golden fields are a real treasure for the kingdom. And the house of Ains, who owns them, is a noble and proud family. The lord of the house Ains must live for these ideals and protect his land. Luzin mentally promised Tom that no matter what happened, he would fix it. Sitting at the table with his subordinates, Carlton said that he thought they would camp by the road tonight, but he never expected to feast here at Innie's castle again. He said it was because of the current circumstances, but they were leaving again tomorrow, so he told them to make sure they didn't get too lazy. Then they all shouted in agreement. Then Carlton's advisor said that they had captured only those villages that resisted to the last, but it seems that the Duke supports them. Carlton waved his hand and told them to make sure the villages had food. He said that one night in jail would be enough for them, so let them be released tomorrow. Then he smiled and said that as far as the servants were concerned, suffering was a great teacher. The servants smiled slyly and said that he was right. They said that the boss had brought this on himself and that it would teach him to be less arrogant and overbearing. Luzin came out from behind the curtain and addressed Carlton. When the Duke entered, he said that he wanted to resume the distribution of rations for the villages under the castle. Then the commander said in a cold tone that this was not negotiable. The man said that tomorrow they were going on the road again, and there was not enough food to provide rations. Then the Duke said that they would provide the necessary provisions themselves. Lewison said he did not want to encroach on something he had promised Carlton. The commander said that he would personally review the case. He put his hand on the documents and said that they all bore the Duke's signature. Then Luzin said that this was true, but ordinary people were not guilty. Then Carlton, twirling a blade of grass in his hands, said that it was a mistake for a simple peasant to meet a foolish lord. The man said that even if the Duke spent the rest of his life working hard, if he made just one mistake, his whole life would be shattered. Luzin lowered his head in embarrassment, thinking that he was right and that he didn't even deserve to feel pain because of his words. Then the Duke knelt down and asked Carlton to take care of these people. He said he would do everything in his power. Carlton looked at Luzin and thought that it was the Duke who had made the mistake, and it would be right for him to correct it. But the commander did not understand why he felt he was the scoundrel. Then Carlton turned to the Duke and said that he was kneeling down very easily. He said that if he was really ready to do everything he said he would do, then such a modest gesture would not be enough. The man ordered him to give his body as well. Carlton looked at the Duke and thought about how he emphasized honesty and asked him to be merciful, but in the end, nothing could be more important to him than the pride of a nobleman. The commander mentally refused to be the only one who was shamed. He was sure that the Duke would not tolerate such humiliation. Then Lewison exclaimed that it was wonderful. Carlton was shocked, not understanding what had happened, and the Duke was smiling and thinking that he could feed everyone in the duchy just by using his body. He thought it was incredible and that he had found a gold mine. Then the Duke stood up and began to undress in front of everyone, and this shocked everyone. Then Carlton looked shocked and wondered if this man wanted to test him. Then the commander thought that the Duke wanted him to order him to stop and thought it was time to see which of them was better. Suddenly he shouted for everyone to leave. When everyone left, Carlton folded his arms across his chest and said that they would see how sincere Luzin was. They looked into each other's eyes, seriously and without hesitation. Then the Duke got down on all fours and approached Carlton. When he was close enough, he sat down on the ground right between his open legs. He untied the ribbon that held his hair in a bun and let it fall over his shoulders. Carlton clenched his fist on the table and told him to continue, while he thought about how far the Duke was willing to go. Then the Duke first ran his hand over the man's thigh and reached for his belt. He fiddled with it for a long time, and the commander asked what he was doing. Then the Duke shyly said that he didn't want to think that he didn't want to, but that the man's belt was difficult to unbuckle. When Carlton saw that face, he was shocked. He stood up and said that was enough. Luzin then asked him, smiling excitedly, why and if it was because the man wanted to take a bath first. Carlton objected, and then the Duke asked him in surprise if he didn't want to take a bath. Then the commander slapped himself on the forehead, exhaled, and said to hell with it. He stood with his back to the Duke and waved his hand and told him to stop there. The man said that when he said he needed to give his body, he was joking. The Duke wanted to say that he was promising something, but Carlton interrupted him, saying that since he seemed confident, he should decide on his own whether to supply or work. Then Luzin's eyes began to shine, and he smilingly agreed and said that he always keeps his promises. He raised his hands and rejoiced and thanked God. Meanwhile, the commander in front of him covered his face with his hand. When he took it away, you could see his shamed face with reddened cheeks. The subordinates were standing in the corridor thinking, and when the commander came out of the dining room, they immediately turned to him. They said that the Duke had come out a minute ago and asked what had happened. Carlton walked past them and simply said that their trip was canceled. He ordered them to help the Duke in whatever he wanted to do. The subordinates were surprised and said that this was a very unexpected change. The man took his sword and headed off somewhere, and the confused subordinates asked where he was going. The commander replied that he was going to the training room. When the commander left, one guy asked about the fact that the commander was training alone on a moonlit night and what was troubling his mind. They thought the commander and the Duke had really done something. One subordinate said that the commander had ordered him to let the Duke do what he wanted. Then they concluded that the men were doing something, and that's why the commander was leaving for training. At that moment, a maid was eavesdropping on them round the corner. When she heard everything, she covered her mouth and started asking about the Duke and Carlton. The Duke's aides were sitting at the table. When he came in, they immediately stood up to ask if he was okay, because they had heard that a terrible thing had happened to him in the village. Someone shouted for a doctor to be called. The Duke smilingly said that there was no need, because it was just a misunderstanding. He took his seat and put his hands on the table and said that they were here today to find a solution to the food problem, so they should put the past aside and focus on overcoming this crisis. Then they said they understood. The manager looked at the Duke as he spoke. He was thinking that from the time of the surrender to the locust attack, he had been surprised to see a radical change in him. But that was not all. Now he really reminded the man of his father. The Duke was only 6 when his father and mother died from an epidemic that was rapidly spreading across the land. Then the servants, realizing how great a burden he had to bear, decided to lay down their lives to protect him. They devoted themselves entirely to his upbringing, behaving as if he were the finest porcelain that could shatter at the slightest touch. As a result, the Duke became a chronic spender. But even so, he is their lord, to whose upbringing they devoted their youth, they gave their best years, and Then the Duke turned to the manager and asked if it could be done. The man smiled, thinking that at a time when the same Duke was asking for his support in the development of his property, there was only one answer he could give him. The manager happily said, "Of course, your lordship." Then the Duke smiled and after a while of silence asked where Ruger was. When the Duke came to Ruger, he looked at the boy in shock, because he was a prisoner. Luzin looked at the boy in shock, and the boy cried and asked how the Duke could not know that he was imprisoned. Then Luzin laughed excitedly and put his finger to his temple, saying that it was like he had just dropped the ball, because no one had told the Duke about it. The Duke said that if he were Carlton or one of his soldiers, he would have given Ruger a good hard time. The aide shouted that the Duke had confused the phrase with his thoughts. Ruger turned back and looked at the men menacingly. He told Luzin that they had attacked him. The angry assistant said that they were all pure evil. Then he turned back to the Duke and said that they did not deserve to live and he should execute them immediately. The men immediately started heading for the bars with frightened looks when they heard Ruger's words. They begged the Duke to have mercy and made excuses that they were extremely hungry and did not deserve to lose their heads. They begged him to spare their lives. Then Luzin held out his palm to indicate that they should be silent. He exhaled and with his eyes closed told them to calm down because no one was going to die. Luzin said that in return, their punishment would be to help him. While the men were working on the street, someone watching them asked if it was not the Duke, but the other 2 who were working there, Timos and Bilter. Then people pointed out that they had been caught yesterday, which was very surprising. The men were cooking something. The Duke based his advice on his experience as a prodigal outcast. If you give a person who hasn't eaten for a long time bread or meat, they will feel sick. In this case, a warm, light soup would be perfect. He gave the villagers soup with a sweet smile and told them to come over. People just looked at him but didn't dare to approach him. Then he thought they were a little uncomfortable around him. Luzin decided to turn to a little girl and offer her a drink first. When the girl came up, the Duke handed her some soup and told her to eat it tonight and wait. Then he added that she should tell the adults that the provisions from the castle would be delivered tomorrow morning. The girl looked at the Duke with a bewildered look, and then asked if they were all doomed because they had lost the war. Then Luzin sat down in front of her and stroking her head asked if she thought it was enough to break the Duchy of Ans, which had existed for thousands of years. He smiled and said that as soon as the castle gates were opened, everything would be fine again. In the end, the Duke apologized for everything they had to go through. Then a man's voice was heard calling all the villagers together, telling them to hurry up and get the soup. People immediately started whispering. They came to take the soup and said that Luzin was their lord, so they should at least trust him. The villagers said that maybe he was a little unreliable, but that was all they could do. Then Carlton rode in on his horse. He stood behind them and calmly watched the happy peasants eating the soup prepared by the Duke. Then the commander turned his gaze to the Duke himself, who was smiling and serving food to his men. The Duke was lying on the bed and smiling. He said happily that it had been a lot of fun. He stretched and lay down on his side and said that now it was time for him to rest. But his thoughts kept him awake. He opened his eyes wide and began to think about the fact that the villagers had food for today, what they would eat tomorrow and the day after that. He wondered if, when Carlton left, they would be able to open the castle gates and if the people would live to see that day. The Duke asked that if their lives depended on rations, what would become of their independence? He exclaimed in alarm and then got out of bed saying that he could not sleep, put on a cape, and said that at such moments you have to act. Carlton was sitting outside playing chess and thoughtfully saying the Duke's name. The commander of the chess team said that Luzin's behavior changes several times a day, and it seems to him that the Duke has several personalities. Carlton described the Duke as someone who first looked like a typical arrogant aristocrat, then like someone as fragile as crystal, and then as nervous as water stirred by the wind. Later, he becomes the embodiment of the ideal leader for the duchy. And in addition, he can become someone who is willing to sacrifice his own body. After this thought, chess pieces started falling off the table because Carlton accidentally dropped one. The commander first held his head and then mentally said that fresh air would dispel these thoughts and got up from the table. When he approached the balcony, he saw a man in a cloak moving quickly. Carlton then wondered in his mind if it was the Duke and what he could be doing at night at this time. Luzin looked to the side and walked on without noticing the commander who was watching him. The Duke lit a fire in the forest and dug a hole. He said he thought they were somewhere here. Suddenly his eyes lit up and he explained what he had found. Luzin pulled out the fruit from the hole and started laughing out loud, happy about it. Suddenly, the commander came out of the bushes and shouted at the Duke. Luzin turned his surprised gaze, and when Carlton saw him, he noticed that he was chewing something and had crumbs around his mouth. When Carlton saw what the Duke was eating, he quickly approached him and grabbed his arm. Luzin told him to wait, but while the commander was pulling his arm, his foot fell off. Carlton took the Duke's hand over his face and angrily asked him, shouting if he thought he was doing and if he knew what he was eating. He ordered Luzin to spit it out immediately and twisted the Duke's head in different directions. While Luzin was on his knees coughing, the commander behind him watched him angrily. The Duke turned his head to the man and asked what it was. Carlton then picked up the fruit the Duke had been eating and said that he had just saved his life again. He asked if he knew what he was about to eat. Luzin took the fruit from Carlton's hands and said he knew it was an old buried furia, a hard vegetable with strange-looking roots that grows everywhere like a weed. If you just eat it, it will cause diarrhea and abdominal pain. But because the toxin is produced by exposure to sunlight, it can be consumed without consequences if fried as soon as it is used. Herzog noted that it is actually quite tasty. Then the commander asked how Luzin knew about it, and he replied that he had eaten it before. The Duke was surprised and asked why a Duke would eat something like that. Luzin was embarrassed and said that it was a long time ago. He turned his head away and said ashamedly that when he was a little boy, he often ate it secretly from others. The commander asked in shock, and the Duke replied that there was not much food, so he could never eat at once. Luzin said that there were times when he just wanted to fill his stomach. The boy thought that Carlton had clearly never been hungry before. Carlton wondered in his mind why the Duke would be hungry. He thought that the old buried furia is used as fodder for cows and pigs, but in the south this plant grows so abundantly that it is not used even for that. With his fist over his mouth, he continued to wonder why the lord of the great plains of the south and the golden fields would eat it. Meanwhile, Luzin, smiling with reddened cheeks, said that although it looked disgusting if it was cooked well, the flesh was very tender and sweet and easy to digest. He said that it was also very nutritious, especially when added to soup. Then he asked if he was listening. Meanwhile, the shocked Carlton wondered in his mind if the Duke's subjects hadn't fed him. The commander thought that perhaps the Duke had been neglected and abused by his own vassals since childhood. Looking at the boy, Carlton thought that he seemed to be really used to fighting on his own. The man grabbed the Duke by the shoulders, and the latter looked at him in surprise and stammered to the commander. Carlton looked at Luzin and said in his mind, "So that's how it is." While each lord is king in his own land, in all but name, a fierce power struggle ensues to decide who will control the territories. Duke Ains inherited the duchy at a very young age and was raised by his servants. No matter how high his title was, he remained a 6-year-old child. It is quite possible that his loyal vassals seized power and mistreated him. If they abandoned him, leaving him to starve in the huge castle, the young duke could wander for a very long time in search of food. What if during his search he came across pigs eating an old buried fury and mistook it for something edible? These were all Carlton's thoughts. He thought it was quite possible because he had no other explanation for it. He looked at the boy and thought that loyal servants would not have allowed him to eat a known poison. The commander thought that he had to conclude that Duke Ains's upbringing was less raw and more practically horrible. This made Carlton very angry, and his face looked very angry. Meanwhile, Luzin picked up the old buried furia from the ground and began to blow on it, blowing away the dust that was on top. Then he turned to the commander and smilingly held it out and asked if he wanted to try it. When Carlton replied that he didn't, the Duke said that was great. Luzin pulled the fruit into his mouth, but was suddenly distracted by Carlton, who asked him if he was really going to eat this disgusting thing. Then the Duke looked at the man and said that was why he dug it up. The commander looked at Luzin's face and wondered how they could have raised him to disrespect even himself. Then Carlton came over and asked if he was so hungry, Why didn't they dig up some more and see if 2 would be enough? Then Luzin smiled and said that 3 would be great. The commander said he understood and started digging. The Duke noted that he was a good digger, and the man replied that he could do almost anything better than him. They gathered a whole sack of these fruits, and the commander said he would take it to the Duke's room. Then the boy asked in surprise why. When Carlton looked at Luzin, he noticed dirt on his cheek and reached out with his free hand and wiped the Duke's cheek with his finger. Suddenly Luzin pulled away and, holding his cheek, asked in shock why the commander had done this. Carlton then calmly asked if he complained even when he was helping. The Duke held his cheek and said that it was not a complaint, that it was just very unusual, his kindness to the Duke. Then the man asked if he had not accepted help from his servants before. The Duke exhaled and asked if, when, he had ever helped him in any way. Carlton turned away and, covering his face with his hand, called the Duke's vassals pieces of garbage. Meanwhile, the Duke was mentally wondering what was wrong with him and whether he had really gone mad. Carlton stood in front of him and said, without looking at Luzin, that he would soon get used to accepting help. The Duke looked at the man a little worriedly and thought that it was none of his business because not a day goes by when he doesn't do something strange. Then he followed the commander and mentally assured himself that he was just enjoying the walk together. The Duke was sitting at a table with his vassals, and behind him were Reuter and the butler. Luzin said he knew they were all working day and night to find a solution to the situation. He said that rationing could be a solution, but there could be a food shortage. The Duke said that he had found an alternative to make this option impossible, an old buried furia. Then 2 maids came up to the audience and opened trays and showed dishes made from this fruit. Luzin sat there smiling, while the minister said that the human body does not accept it, because the toxin may be weak, but it exists. Then the Duke said that it was not a problem because he had just eaten a few yesterday, and as they could see, was perfectly fine. The men asked him in shock if he really ate the old buried furia. He kept smiling and confirmed that he had eaten it. Then Reuter handed him a book, and he said that they were all familiar with the chronicle from their ancestors. Luzin said that it mentions the use of furies in 222, when the wheat crop was damaged by frost. It also states that their roots become toxic only after exposure to sunlight. He thought about how he had spent the whole night searching for this document in the library. Now he was smiling as he held the book in his hands. He thanked his ancestors for writing about it. The minister first turned to Luzin excitedly, and then turned to the manager and shouted at him. Meanwhile, the manager tasted the cooked furia and after chewing a bit said that it was quite tasty. The commander of the knights smiled and said that it really tasted better than it looked. He supported that the old buried fury could be found everywhere, so there would be no shortage of it. The maid was also happy to eat the strange dish. The manager said that with the historical documents and their lord's experience, they would create a demand for these tubers. Then the Duke smilingly turned to the minister, and the minister exhaled and said that the Duke had won. The commander held the plate with furia in his hands and asked if the people would really agree to eat it. The Duke put his hand at his chest and smilingly told them to leave it to him. He said that he would assure the people in the village that it was safe to use it and show them how to do it properly. The Duke watched the peasants work, and Reuter stood next to him. One of the vassals ordered the peasants to put the wheat on the left and the old buried fury on the right. One of the peasants said that the third one was full and they were ready for the fourth. Luzin laughed and said that the preparations were going very well. Then he turned and his mood became gloomy. Carlton was walking behind them, smiling broadly. He asked if everything was going well. Then the Duke mentally wondered what had happened to the commander this time. The peasants worked hard to get everything done. The Duke watched with concern, wondering if there was anything he could do to help. Then he looked at the peasants carrying the sacks. He began to do the same and urged Reuter on. The assistant asked why they should carry it if the servants could do it. Luzin said that everyone was busy and they had to help. Reuter asked why they should hurt themselves for nothing. He wanted to say something else, but quickly fell silent when he saw the Duke's dangerously frightening look. When Reuter took hold of the other end, the Duke smiled happily and counted down to them, lifting at the same time. But before they could do so, an embarrassed butler came running to them, loudly calling out to the Duke. When the butler stood next to Luzin, he took him by the hand and told him that he would get hurt and asked him to leave the weight to them. Then the surprised Dukes said that at least he could bear it. Then the butler firmly said that it was not up for discussion and pointed back and asked him to wait there. The Duke smiled awkwardly and thought that he hadn't felt this way for a long time. They treat it as if it will crumble at the slightest touch. They even seemed to want to breathe for him. He thought that this was a familiar feeling of overprotection. He recalled that when he cut firewood as a traveler, he had no problems. Luzin was saddened by these memories because back then he spent most nights on the streets, but even after beatings he recovered in a few days. He was not the same 6-year-old boy anymore. He wondered in his mind how long they were going to hold him back. Lewison stood between the bags, looking down. Carlton was standing nearby, and he looked at the Duke and noticed that his eyes were very red. The man thought that Lewison looked as if he were on the verge of tears. The Duke began to wipe his eyes with his sleeve and thought that he had been up all night reading books, and that was why his eyes were now sore. Carlton, standing behind him, thought that it seemed to him that the Lord's servants were very determined to retain power, preventing him from taking over the mantle of the Duke. The commander clenched his fist, thinking that they were treating him as if he were unable to take care of himself. Suddenly, the Duke looked in front of him and wondered if anyone was remembering him. This is how things were at the moment. Lewison sat with his head down. He smiled, though it was not a sincere smile, and turned to Carlton. The Duke asked the man how long he would follow him. The commander asked again and said that this was absurd, because he was just escorting the wagon. Then the man smiled and turned to the Duke and said that he suggested he mind his own business. Lewison thought about the fact that he had put on a smile, but it didn't change his words. He wanted to say something, but he thought about the fact that Carlton looked at him as if he were always ready to kill. But when he wasn't making a murderous expression, the commander was actually quite charming. When the Duke realized what he was thinking, he blushed sharply and looked away from Carlton in agitation. The man asked what was wrong, but the Duke stammered out that nothing at all. While the commander looked at the boy with a questioning look, he mentally forced himself not to look into Carlton's eyes. Then Ruger leaned over to the Duke, and covering himself with his hand so that the commander could not hear, asked Lewison why this rude man was so interested in him. The aide said that it looked creepy. Lewison said that he did not know what the reason was. The Duke thought that he wanted to know even more than Ruger. Then the assistant said that now the Duke looks much stranger than Carlton. He said that Lewison would never have allowed someone like Carlton to treat him like that before. Then he asked why he had the feeling that the Duke had changed a few months ago. This greatly confused Lewison, who then asked Ruger why he did not like Carlton in general. Ruger asked if he really didn't understand the reason. The boy said that Carlton was not even a knight, but just an arrogant nobody from the people who had forgotten his place. The Duke exhaled and thought that this was true and remembered that Ruger was also from an aristocratic family. He looked up at his assistant and mentally wondered which house he was from. Here the Duke was informed that they had already arrived. Lewison said that this was very good and was about to go down, asking him to wait a moment. Then Carlton appeared next to the place where the Duke was to go down and offered his help. The Duke thanked him and put his small hand in the commander's palm. The man gently held the Duke's shoulder with one hand and helped him down without injury. This even made Lewison a little embarrassed and his cheeks turned red. The Duke said it was really not necessary. Then Carlton turned his head back and said that he was preparing for the upcoming test. He looked at Ruger, and after he said that, he smiled, and the assistant was already boiling with anger. As the Duke and his commander passed, the villagers paid attention to them. One man said that Sir Carlton could not take his eyes off their lord. The peasants said that you don't see such a look every day. In fact, the Duke was smiling falsely through his teeth and asking why the commander shouldn't give him more space. The man said that Lewison might be attacked again, so he did not move away. Then the men began to discuss what it meant that the rumors were true. One of them asked what rumors they were talking about. The man whispered in his ear that it was said that Carlton had used the rationing as an excuse to take possession of the Duke's body. The man asked if that was all there was to it, and then the man said that Carlton had fallen in love with the Duke and was constantly pursuing him. The manager was concerned and asked the butler what he had said. The butler said that the servant had heard that Carlton's men whispered to each other for this effect. The manager abruptly rose from his chair so that it fell over. He asked in shock how this could happen, and the butler held him up. The manager called the Duke his precious little lord and fragile, wonderful Duke. He became very angry and called Carlton a pig through clenched teeth, and then shouted and asked him how he dared to treat the Duke like that. The villagers ate the old buried furia, and one man said that it was better than he expected, because in fact these fruits were very tasty. After the man's words, another man also decided to try the strange dish. As the Duke and Carlton stood behind them, one woman asked another if she was still skeptical, even after seeing the Duke himself eat them. The peasant woman objected, saying that she was not. The Duke smiled as he watched the people. Then Carlton looked at him and said that some people still had doubts. Lewison said calmly that he expected this, and there are still those here whom they managed to convince. Then, beaming with joy, the Duke said that as for the others, talk and time would convince them. Carlton's eyes narrowed, and he thought that if it were not for the oppression of Lewison's subjects, he would have been a much better lord. The man told the Duke that on the way back he would teach him one or two things about riding. Then the embarrassed Lewison asked if the man knew about his inability to ride. The commander looked at the Duke with a smile and recalled how the Duke could not get on a horse and asked how, after what he had seen, he could not have known about it. Carlton said he couldn't even pretend not to know. Lewison stood there with his hands over his red face and thought that he was very ashamed. Then the Duke said that in that case, he would be able to see for himself how good a writing teacher Carlton was. The commander smiled and said that he would not be disappointed. The vassals were standing at the gate, and the manager was pacing nervously from side to side. When someone approached him, he said that the last wagons had long since returned and asked when the Duke would finally return. Then Lewison's voice was heard telling Carlton not to let go of the bridle. The commander asked if he was going to bring his servants to the battlefield. When the manager heard their voices, he immediately turned in their direction. The Duke smilingly said that he just needed to find a horse that was suitable for him, not one that would throw him off at the first opportunity. The vassals looked at the lord and thought that he looked very majestic on horseback. Carlton smiled back at Lewison and said that a good craftsman does not blame his tools. When the vassals noticed Carlton, they thought that unfortunately he had noticed it too. They looked at him and saw that he couldn't take his eyes off of me. As they approached the gate, the Duke noticed his vassals and asked what had brought them all outside the gate. The manager smiled and said that the Duke had done a great job today. Carlton said that he was here too, in case he hadn't noticed, but the manager just walked past without answering. The man approached the Duke and, putting his hand at his chest, smiled again and said that he had come because he had several questions to discuss about the land. The commander looked at him and mentally wondered when they had started discussing these matters with him and whether they felt their power was declining with the Duke's growing power. Then he thought that if he wanted a fight, he could not refuse. Carlton began to approach the Duke and nudged the manager with his shoulder. He smiled sweetly at Lewison and extended his hand to the Duke, offering him a hand to grab and saying that he would help him down. The manager stood behind him, shocked and angry. The manager angrily stood in front of the commander and stretched out his hand, asking to be allowed to help him. Lewison watched this tiredly for a few seconds and then took hold of Carlton's palm. He smiled and told the manager that he shouldn't strain himself because he had a back problem. The manager looked at him in shock and Carlton laughed. Suddenly, the Duke began to fall, but Carlton managed to stretch out his arms and catch him by the waist. Lewison held onto the man's broad shoulders, looking into his eyes in surprise. However, the commander looked at him calmly, and there was not a bit of embarrassment on his face. Their faces were already quite close, and the shamed Duke asked if he could lower him. When the commander lowered Lewison, the manager immediately went to the Duke and asked where he had left the servants who had come here alone with Carlton. Then Lewison said, smiling excitedly, that Rover was always busy. Then I heard the voice of Carlton's word calling for his commander. He quickly ran to meet him, and his face looked shocked. Then the boy informed him that a message of surrender had arrived from the Winard house. The Duke asked in surprise, and Carlton calmly asked if they had sent the message now. The subject confirmed, and then, catching his breath, said that he had refused to tell them anything until they brought the Duke. Then the guy anxiously pointed at himself and asked if it was really him. Carlton and Lewison entered a room. A man sat at a table and looked at Carlton's subjects. He introduced himself as Bolton, the eldest son and heir to the Viscountcy of Winard. Bolton said that he had traveled all the way here on his own and was now being treated badly. He said that the knights did not know anything about aristocrats. When the commander got up and headed toward the aristocrat, Lewison grabbed his arm. Carlton looked at him and he said excitedly that he could not kill him. Then the man said he would not, and when the Duke said not to hit the aristocrat, he said he would try. Bolton rose from his chair and addressed the Duke in a loud voice. Rubbing his hands together, he approached him and said he was honored to have come to this humble place. Lewison asked why he insisted on meeting him. Bolton said they set off immediately after receiving his official message and arrived here after a 3-day trip. Then he said that they were fools to say that the official message had been sent a long time ago and that the locust swarms had already disappeared. The Duke asked in surprise but received no answer. Angry, Carlton asked if they hadn't sent a messenger when the war was already around the corner. Bolton was also angry and said that the wizard family was a prestigious southern family with a long, rich history. He said that he would never do such a cowardly thing. Then the Duke seemed to understand and asked Lord Bolton how long ago he had left the Viscountcy. When the Lord replied that it was 3 days ago, the Duke said excitedly that more than 10 days had passed since he had sent the message. Bolton asked in surprise if he meant to say that they had spent a whole week wandering through the woods. He said that was probably not true because they had gotten caught in the fog, but he was sure that they had kept on the road and were focused. Then another man took the Lord's hand and told him to calm down. The Duke quietly asked the commander if he thought that Bolton was telling the truth. Carlton closed his eyes and said that it was probably a lie, although he played well. Lewison said that if the man was lying, he would have given a better reason than just the fog. Carlton said it was possible, but it was hard to believe his story. The Duke thought about it and said that someone must have deliberately interrupted them. After thinking for a few seconds, he looked up and smiled and said that it could have been a wizard. The commander said that if it was magic, it would have left traces, but their patrols had not sent a report of the anomaly. Upset, Luzin asked if it wasn't magic, how could it have taken so long to cover a distance that takes 3 days? Carlton nodded to his ward, and he did the same in return. Then he put his hand on the Duke's shoulder and let him out, saying that it was time to return to the castle. Lewison asked excitedly what was going on with the surrender negotiations. The commander took hold of the bridle and said that they would give him a day to come to his senses, and they could start negotiations tomorrow. He put the Duke on his course and said that he should not worry about it. Then the man sat behind him and they rode off. The knight stood looking after them and wondered why it looked as if it was natural for them. Another said that he was curious too, and that it looked like the rumors about Commander Carlton's feelings for the Duke were true. The Duke smilingly asked if, when the negotiations with the House of Winard were over, Carlton's mission would be complete. He confirmed this and said that they would officially receive the surrender from every southern lord. Lewison said that this would only strengthen the position of the first prince. Luzin asked if Carlton would return to the capital, and the man replied that he should. The Duke said that he hesitated before answering and that it was not like him. He asked why the commander was sorry to leave. Then he emphasized each word and said, "Not at all." The Duke laughed and said he knew he would say that. Carlton looked at him and thought that the Duke's touch was very natural, just as it had been before. Carlton pressed his hand against the Duke's and asked if he had always been so reckless. Lewison turned his head and exclaimed in question. Herzog turned his head back and closed his eyes, folded his arms, and said that he had been told many times that he did not pay attention to social norms, but this was the first time in his memory that he had been called reckless. He smiled and asked why he was like that in the eyes of the commander. Carlton thought for a while, then smiled and said he couldn't deny it. When Luzin looked at the man's smiling face, he immediately turned around because his face turned treacherously red. Luzin wondered in his mind if Carlton could smile like that. He thought that the commander was always very angry when he looked at him. Now, as the Duke thought, shock made his heart beat faster. The villagers asked if the bread was made from old furia. It was very crispy, and the longer you chewed, the sweeter it became. One villager said it was a pity there was no butter, but it was still delicious. All around us we could only hear happy sounds from such delicious food. Then one man looked at the Duke, who was eating 2 loaves of bread at the same time, eating so appetizingly that crumbs could be seen all over his face. The peasant asked the Duke what brought him here. Luzin smiled and said that he had come here to ask about something, but when he saw the bread, he could not resist. As he chewed, he asked the villagers if there had been anything strange in the land recently. When they asked him again, he said something about fog or disappearances or confusion with dates. Then the woman said that since the construction of the reservoir last spring, there has been constant fog. She said that even with monsters, disappearances are not uncommon. One woman stood behind her and shook her head in agreement. Then she began to talk about mixed-up days, and the Duke listened intently. Then the woman asked, "Isn't that a sign that you have one foot in the grave?" The women laughed, and Lewison laughed with them. The Duke took another bite, and then thought that Lord Bolton must have lied. He turned his attention to Carlton and his subject, who were discussing something. The subject smilingly said that given the absurd responses of House Vinard, their negotiations with them had ended favorably. Then the boy asked the captain when they would return to the capital. Carlton thought about it and then looked at the Duke and said that he wanted to assess the situation before making any decision. Luzin approached him and handed him a loaf of bread and asked if he wanted to try it. When the commander began to say that he did not want to, the Duke forced the bread into his mouth and said that his refusal was denied. As the men looked at Luzin, he ran away laughing. The subject asked when the two had become so close. Carlton took a bite and chewed, angrily asked again, and laughed absurdly. Then the boy asked the commander if he really fell in love with the Duke. The commander was very angry and lifted the prisoner up, looking at him menacingly. The boy started waving his hands and said, embarrassed, that it was just rumors and whispers that were going around the castle. He said that people were saying that the commander had fallen in love with the Duke and was always watching him. Carlton clicked his tongue and, remembering the angry vassals, wondered why the wariness of the Duke's servants suddenly made sense. The commander released the knight. The guy said, catching his breath, that at first Carlton was the one who wanted to go on the road right away, but now he was planning to wait for the situation to develop. The subject asked if it was possible that the commander was worried about the Duke. Carlton scratched his neck, saying that this was absurd. He began to talk about people's thoughts, but abruptly stopped when the image of the Duke appeared in his mind, smiling sincerely. The commander's eyes immediately rounded, and he asked in surprise if he had fallen in love with the Duke. Carlton looked down and thought that the time they spent together proved that the Duke was different from all the aristocrats he had known before. Because of Louisen's horrific childhood, the commander is a little more interested in his well-being. Suddenly, the commander's mood changed. He was very angry and clenched his fist with one hand, telling his subject that if he believed this nonsense, then his life must have been very comfortable lately. After these words, the knight screamed. After the commander gave his subordinate a few kicks, he smiled and scratched his head, saying that thank God it wasn't true. Then the guy said that they had received a message from Annis, whom Carlton had brought closer to the first prince. He said that the commander seemed to be focused on another matter, but the commander interrupted him and ordered him to continue. The subordinate said that it seemed that the situation had become quite tense recently. The boy told the commander that attempts to tarnish his reputation were continuing. He advised Carlton to return to the prince as soon as possible. The commander exhaled, calling them fucking bastards. The knight said that she also warned him to proceed with caution because the nobles from the south were acting suspiciously. Carlton thought about the southern aristocracy and asked if he should send them a warning. The boy asked again, but the commander turned around and said that it was okay. Carlton thought that was enough, and according to the Duke, he had barely passed the test of the first prince. He thought he could barely manage his own affairs. The commander picked up a map and ordered his subject to divide the men into offensive and defensive groups. He said that the offensive group would go with him first, and that they should be ready to leave in 2 days. The knight first asked in surprise and then stammered and agreed. Carlton looked at Louisen and thought that the calm atmosphere of the south had weakened his mind. Then the Duke, sitting between the sacks carried by the peasants, waved to the commander, addressing him. The commander looked at the guy smiling and thought that when he was weakening, unnecessary emotions were making their way. He mentally told himself that this could not be true. The subordinate ordered everyone to speed up their preparations because they were returning to the capital. Everyone was busy getting ready, and Carlton was watching. There was a lot of commotion outside, and a lot of voices were heard. Louisen was watching from the window, and his expression looked sad. Meanwhile, Ruger was folding some books and smiling and muttering something. Without turning around, the Duke asked why he was so happy. The assistant enthusiastically affirmed and continued to smile, saying that they would finally get rid of this pain in the ass. He threw his arms out in the air and started laughing. Then Ruger got down on one knee and said that it would be a melancholy time. Meanwhile, the Duke sat on the bed, his head down sadly, thinking that he had actually thought he and Carlton had become a little closer. He could not have imagined that he would learn of his husband's departure from the manager. When Ruger noticed the Duke's upset look, he sat down next to him and told him that he could now enjoy everything as he had before. He said that he should not fill his head with unnecessary things. He told him to just leave everything to his servants. Ruger then suggested that we organize a grand celebration. Then the Duke looked at him with a blank stare and said in a cold tone that all his friends had died during the war. Ruger stammered excitedly and said that he could simply make new ones. Louisen pulled his knees over to him and put his hands on them and rested his face there. He said that at least Ruger was in a good mood and that his assistant must have a wonderful life. The smile disappeared from Ruger's face, and he put his hand on the Duke's back and told him not to forget that he had him. The guy said that everything would go back to the way it was before. The Duke thought that this was true, and when Carlton left, all the responsibility for the new future would fall on his shoulders. Tears began to drip from his eyes, and he wondered in his mind why he felt sad. Suddenly, he bit his lip and stood up abruptly, saying that this was not going to happen. Ruger then asked him excitedly where he was going. The Duke looked very determined and then said that he was going to declare war. When the Duke was standing in the corridor, he saw Carlton walking in front of him and smilingly began to call on him, but was interrupted by the manager who said he had a question. This angered Louisen a little. Then, as the manager left, he smilingly told him to wait. Then he excitedly ran after Carlton, calling to him and saying that he wanted to talk to him for a minute. But suddenly other assistants appeared in front of him with documents in their hands. They asked that Louisen help them with this. At the time, the Duke did not understand what was happening and asked in surprise. So all day long, the Duke was chased by servants, asking where to put a thing or asking what filling he would choose. This went on until the evening. They all called him, and all he could hear was "Your Grace." When he got tired of it, he shouted for them to stop calling him. He looked tired and couldn't understand why they were keeping him from meeting Carlton, but if they kept doing it, he had an idea. At night, when everyone was already asleep, the Duke snuck into Carlton's room. The commander was sleeping, and then the boy exhaled a breath and quietly addressed the man. The Duke stood over Carlton, who was sleeping peacefully. He thought that this had originally been his room, but to see Sir Carlton lying there without his clothes on seemed a bit strange. He reached out with his hand, saying the man's name. Suddenly, Carlton pulled him by his shirt and threw him on the bed, hovering over him, holding a sharpened dagger to the man's throat. Luzin held onto the man's hand, frightened, saying that it was him. The commander looked at him and thought that the Duke would never have come here at this hour. The man took the dagger and wondered if he was dreaming. Carlton began to run his hand under the Duke's nightgown, rising higher and higher, and noticed that he was not wearing underwear. He began to shake and watched. When the man almost reached his chest, a groan escaped the Duke, and he bent at the waist. Luzin bit his lip, holding back the moan that wanted to escape his lips. Carlton continued to run his hands over the boy's body, thinking that this was more real than he could have imagined. The Duke began to clutch the blanket in his hand. Then suddenly he punched the commander in the face, angrily asking what he thought Sir Carlton was doing. When the man felt the blow on his face, he looked forward in shock. He put his hand to his cheek and said out loud that it was indeed his lordship, and began to justify himself by saying that he was sleepy. Ashamed, the Duke angrily asked him if he was in the habit of groping people in his half-sleep. Carlton cleared his throat and asked what had brought the Duke here and why he had crawled into someone else's bed in the middle of the night, dressed in such delicate and flimsy clothes. Lowson said, ashamed, that coming in this way was the only possible solution if he did not want Ruger to notice him. Then he angrily told the commander to be more precise, because he was the one who had grabbed Lewison and thrown him on the bed. Carlton glared at the Duke, and the Duke turned his face away, mentally wondering why he was looking at him like that. The commander stood up and, standing with his back to Lewison, took his shirt and said that this could not be. Then the Duke looked at him and asked what he was talking about. When Carlton looked at him over his bare shoulder, the boy turned around in shame. His cheeks were red, and he thought that it surprised him. When the man put on his shirt, he asked what he wanted to talk about. Then the Duke turned around and asked why he was doing everything so hastily. The commander calmly replied that it was probably because he was in a hurry. Luzin said the investigation into what happened to the people of the Vinard house is not yet complete, and there are still many things to be packed. He said that such a rush could cause problems. Meanwhile, Carlton sat down in the chair across from the bed and said that it was none of the Duke's business. Lewison then said that they had spent a lot of time together while he was here, and then asked if he wanted to leave without even saying goodbye. At that moment, the commander looked down and thought that as soon as he left, the hyena and the other Duke's servants would not leave him alone. He wondered in his mind how Luzin could be so naive. Carlton didn't want to start a conflict with the southern aristocrats, but perhaps he should ask the Duke to come with him to the capital. Then the Duke interrupted his thoughts by saying that he could understand his impatience to return to the first prince's side. He said that if he was left alone, the nobles would definitely want to send him back to the battlefield. The boy added that he would have done the same in his place. While he was saying this, Carlton was looking at him in shock. Suddenly, the commander asked where the Duke had heard about it, but he looked at him frightened and did not know what to say. Scratching the back of his head, he said excitedly that it was just a guess based on what he knew of his situation. Luzin was thinking about how, as far as he could remember, it was around this time that Carlton was sent to the border under the pretext of fighting monsters. The commander lowered his head and said that Luzin's mind would never cease to amaze him. He said that his worry for the boy was so funny. Carlton thought that this Duke, the Supreme Lord of the South, was nothing but a low-born knight. He clenched his fists, thinking that all this time he had not been able to realize that they were from completely different worlds. The commander stood up and said that perhaps Luzin had forgotten, but he was the one who had come to seize the duchy. The Duke replied excitedly that this was true. At that moment, he felt as if his mood had returned to the moment of their first meeting. Carlton looked at him and said that he believed he would understand what he was talking about. Then he calmly said that if he had nothing more to say, he should go back. The commander looked at the bed thinking that this was the end. As he approached the door, he thought that he would probably never see the Duke again, and now it was time for him to return to reality. Carlton walked among his subordinates and said that except for those who accompany the carts at the end, everyone else was moving with him at full gallop. He then said that if anyone had any objections, they should speak now. Then the Duke's attention was drawn to him, who ran to the commander and shouted for him to wait. When he ran up, he stopped to catch his breath, and Carlton then turned to him. Luzin was clutching an envelope and looked up and said that he liked Carlton. Carlton's eyes widened, and he began to ask in shock and stammering what he was talking about. Then the Duke handed him an envelope. Meanwhile, everyone around him looked at it in shock and could not say anything. Looking at the letter, the commander wondered in his mind if it meant that the Duke really liked him in that way. Luzin looked down and said that it was not much, but his return to the capital would not change his heart. Then he said that if the commander did not mind, he would deliver this letter to the Marquis of Natran. While the subordinates behind him breathed a sigh of relief, Carlton could not believe that it was just an errand. The man looked sadly to the side, realizing that this was not for him, and thought that he had once again mistaken his wish for reality. Suddenly, he caught himself thinking about what he wanted and wondered if the Duke wanted him to confess his feelings. but he ended up thinking that this was an absurd thought. The commander asked about the Marquis of Natron if he meant the former field marshal. The Duke confirmed this and said that Carlton could meet him if he mentioned his name. He said that the Marquis was a bit extravagant and eccentric, but would probably accept the commander's impulsiveness as an interesting character. Lawson said he could help the man. Carlton looked at the envelope and thought that the Duke was using the letter as an opportunity to pave the way between him and the Marquis, even if his own name might suffer. Then the man asked why he was helping him so much. Then the Duke smiled and reminded him that he had already said he liked him. Carlton's face turned red, and he wondered in shock why the hell his heartbeat had accelerated. The man turned around and turned his head slightly to thank the Duke. He walked forward without turning around, and his face continued to burn. Meanwhile, the Duke was standing behind him, smiling and looking at the commander. The Duke watched the knights go and thought that Carlton had left, so this was the end of their unhappy relationship. He believed that the man was the one who had chosen the wrong future, just like the Duke. Luzon believed that if Carlton's future changed, maybe his would too. He prayed that the man's future would be blessed. A few days later, the Duke was sitting in his study reading some documents. Suddenly, a noise outside the window attracted his attention, and he approached it and saw a man on a horse with a flag. He noticed the flag and realized that it was the army of the first prince. Then the Duke was told that a message had been received from the royal family. The aides and the Duke sat at the table asking many questions while he read the letter. Luzon said that he had been invited to the capital. The commander of the knights asked if he had to go now. The Duke said yes, ostensibly to discuss reparations for prisoners of war. The Duke said that the king was in critical condition. Then the manager said that the prince should prepare for the next events. The minister asked if other great lords were also arriving in the capital. Luzon said that they hadn't and that he was probably the first to be invited. The minister asked if it wasn't suspicious, and the manager confirmed it, but it wasn't a report that could be dismissed. The minister said it was nothing to be concerned about. The Duke thought that this was strange, and not only that. He remembered how the messenger had told him that he kept running into monsters in the forest, and he had lost his way because of a very thick fog. Luzon's brow furrowed as he thought that the messenger from the capital had experienced the same thing as Vinard's men. He looked out the window and wondered what the hell was going on. Suddenly he was distracted by the manager, who said that there were not many knights in the duchy, and he was worried about who would accompany the Duke on his journey. Then Luzon smiled and said that there was no need to worry. The Duke said the message said the messenger would ride ahead and stop Sir Carlton, so they could meet in the middle. Here they shouted loudly, Carlton, and a sound made Luzon's ears bleed. The manager asked about the fact that they had been together with that scoundrel all the way to the capital, and then said that this was not discussed. The minister asked why the Duke was thinking about the possibility of meeting that villain again. The commander said that he would rather go with the Duke. Luzon smiled and told him to calm down and not to worry. He said that Sir Carlton was treating him well. The men looked at the Duke in shock and then unanimously shouted that this was the problem. The Duke was riding in a carriage and thinking about the fact that this was his first trip to the capital. He recalled how his aides were crying and begging him to beware of Carlton, and Luzon did not understand why everyone was so dramatic. Herzog said that even if it was all because of Carlton, he didn't understand why his traveling with him was so disturbing to others. Then he asked Ruger if he was wrong. The assistant didn't seem to hear him and continued to stare calmly out the window. Luzon wondered in his mind what had happened to Ruger. He thought that after the fuss he had made about the journey to the capital, the Duke would have expected his aide to be happy. But as they prepared to travel, he had not said a word. The Duke thought that Ruger's mind was on something else. After drinking tea, Luzon thought that maybe the boy would be himself when they arrived in the capital. Suddenly, he began to feel very drowsy. Then Ruger took the cup from the Duke's hands and said that if he was exhausted, he could rest. The Duke was falling asleep and said that if he fell asleep now, he would be awake all night. He barely opened his eyes to look at Ruger, and then he saw the boy smile. The assistant told him to just go to sleep. Ruger put the cup on the table and approached the Duke, stroking his head. The aide smiled and said that if Luzon did that, they would arrive faster. The Duke was starting to open his eyes because he heard someone calling him. Suddenly, he heard a loud scream calling out to him and a sharp pain shot through his head. He held his head in pain and wondered when he had passed out. He wondered what the hell was going on, but when he turned his head, he was in shock. Outside the window, the knights were fighting monsters and shouting that they needed to defend the rear and stand in a circle to protect the carriage. Then the Duke heard someone say that the fog was very thick and they could barely see. The Duke shouted in shock that there were fierce wolves outside the window. He could not understand why these animals were attacking them. Usually wolves are hunters and strategists, so why would they attack such a large motorcade as the Duke's? One of the wolves rushed through the open door of the carriage and growled at Luzon. Saliva dripped from his mouth, and he pawed at the door. The Duke looked at this and thought that if they were chasing the prey behind them, they would not attack something that had good security. When one of the wolves with white fur and red eyes pulled up the boards from above and stood looking at Luzin, he thought it looked like they were here to capture him. Then the Duke's cry was heard, and the knights who were fighting the wolves realized that the carriage was under attack. Luzin continued to shout, and then the men turned their heads in his direction and saw him being pulled by a white wolf, by his clothes and others heading toward the Duke. The wolf was dragging the Duke, and he was beginning to suffocate because his clothes were pressing on his throat. Suddenly, someone's voice was heard calling out to the Duke, and the wolf let go of him, turning his head away abruptly. As Luzin got up from the ground, he wondered what was going on. He knew that the fierce wolves were intelligent monsters, but he did not understand why they had dragged him here alive, as if they were being controlled by someone. The wolves stood around the Duke and growled fiercely with their red eyes. Someone's footsteps were heard, and when the Duke looked up, he saw a man standing in front of him, Ruder, who was wearing armor and a red cape. He was looking down at the Duke. When Luzin turned to him, the aide smiled and said that he expected the Duke to cry and make a fuss, but he was quite calm and did not even seem very surprised. The Duke held his hand and looked at the boy angrily. He said he was too stunned to cry. Then he asked Ruder if he was the one who controlled the wolves, who ordered it, and what he expected by kidnapping him. Ruder was silent for a while, and then sat down in front of the Duke. He said that something had been bothering him for some time. The aide said that complacency and thoughtlessness had always been the Duke's best traits, but at some point he suddenly started saying such clever things. Ruger put his hand to Luzin's cheek where the scratch was and told him to look at it. He told him that if he had run away with him that day, he would not have gotten these injuries. While the boy was smiling slyly, the Duke looked at him with round eyes, asking questions. Then the Duke remembered the day they were supposed to escape. Luzin began to wonder in his mind whether he had ordered his aide to prepare for the escape. Ruder was the first to say that Luzin should run away from Carlton, and the one who told the Duke various horrible rumors was also Ruder. The Duke hit Ruder on the hand, forcing him to take it away from his face. He then realized that the death of his assistant in his past life was a mere performance. Herzog asked with his head down why. He looked up at Ruder and asked if the person supporting him wanted him to fall more than he wanted him to die. Ruger clenched his fist and said that he had betrayed him. Then he approached Luzin and asked him frighteningly if that was the only thing he was interested in. Ruger said that ever since that dirt, Carlton, appeared, the Duke was always talking about him, even though the aide was the only one on his side. Then the guy put a bandage on the Duke's face and said that enough of this chatter. Luzin tried to get away, but it was all in vain. Ruger said that he didn't like having to drug the Duke twice in one day. Then Luzin realized why he felt sleepy. He had put something in his tea. Ruger opened some liquid and said that if the Duke slept a little longer, they would really make it this time. The aide held the liquid to the Duke's face so that he could inhale its smell, and he closed his eyes slightly and put his nose to Luzin's head. The Duke mentally asked him to wait, but after he inhaled, he began to feel drowsy again, just as he had then. When the Duke's body was completely relaxed, Ruder put him in his arms. The boy lowered his head closer and closer to Luzin's face. When their lips were close enough, he called him his lord and drew closer so that their lips were almost touching. Suddenly a voice was heard telling Ruger to stop. A spear was thrown in the boy's direction, which sliced his cheek as it flew by. When he turned, holding the Duke in his arms, he saw Carlton standing nearby. Carlton looked angrily at the boy, saying that he was Duke Ains's escort. Ruger simply smiled in response, ignoring the fact that blood was running down his cheek. Carlton said that Ruger was a servant who had kidnapped his master and even used monsters. He asked, smiling, why the Duke was surrounded only by annoying flies like Ruder. The boy, holding the Duke in his arms, angrily said that this had nothing to do with the commander and that he should not interfere. When he shouted this, the angry wolves bared their fangs and ran at Carlton. The man pulled out his sword and ran angrily toward Ruder, cutting through the wolves' bodies. Then he asked if there was anything wrong, and then shouted loudly that he was the only witness to the kidnapping. He jumped up and landed in front of Ruder. When he wanted to insult the man, Carlton looked at him coldly and swung his sword. He cut his hand, and the man let go of the Duke, and the commander immediately picked him up. Carlton held the Duke with one hand and held his sword in the other to defend himself against Ruder. He thought that it might be worthwhile to fight him, but he was not alone and it was too difficult with the Duke in his arms. Then a horse ran up to them. It quickly bypassed the wolves and continued on its way to Carlton without stopping. Then the commander, with the Duke in his hands, climbed on the horse and shouted for it to run faster. Then Ruger shouted and asked him if he thought he would let him escape. The boy stretched out his hand and ordered the wolves to bring him the Duke. Then they immediately went after the horse. Carlton turned around and threw several daggers at them and hit one of the wolves in the eye. This paused the monsters for a while, but Ruver shouted angrily again to catch them immediately. While the commander was racing through the forest on horseback, Ruver was chasing them from behind on White Wolf, and 2 others were running beside him. Carlton looked back, thinking that they would be able to get away from him, but he could not even imagine that Ruger would control these animals so well that he would be able to ride them. The commander realized that the forest terrain was undoubtedly helping the ferocious wolves, and if they continued, they would be overtaken. Carlton approached the cliff and thought it was the only way to get rid of them. When one of the wolves jumped to grab them, Carlton held the Duke close to him and jumped down, right into the current. Ruger squeezed the wolf's fur and asked how dare he. He swung his sword and cut off the monster's paw. He shouted and called the commander a dirty peasant. The guy was smiling madly and said that Carlton should remember that he would hunt him down and kill him. The Duke dreamt that he was called a vile beggar. The villagers asked if he was sending ordinary people to their deaths for his own survival. Someone begged him to save them. Cold hands reached out and someone said they were hungry and their throat was dry. The Duke stood barefoot in the snow and thought about the bitter cold. When he looked up, he saw the saint smiling before him. When he saw him, he smiled back and turned to him. He reached out his hand to the man and felt warmth. When he opened his eyes, Luzin touched someone's flesh and said that he was very warm. Then he mentally asked again and opened his eyes wide. He touched Carlton's hot body, and the latter, pulling him close, said that the Duke was already awake. Luzin quickly jumped away from the man and shouting. Then the commander said that the Duke was quite energetic this morning. Carlton stood up and asked how he felt. The Duke was sitting with his back to him, his face was red, and his heart was beating out of his chest. He did not answer the man's question, but asked where they were. He said he clearly remembered how Shelma Rudra drugged him. Carlton said that after that he grabbed him and escaped with the help of a waterfall. The Duke turned to look at the man, but said nothing. Louison exhaled and smiled, saying that this explained why they were in this position. He thanked Carlton for saving him, but holding his head said that the method was crazy. While the commander was getting dressed, the Duke asked if he was not the first among the soldiers to march to the capital. Carlton said that a royal messenger had met them on the way, and the commander was on his way back to accompany the Duke when a pack of ferocious wolves attacked. Luzin's hands began to shake, and he clutched his clothes and asked what happened to the others. Carlton said he did not know. The Duke replied that he understood and began to think excitedly about the fact that in the carriage, when he was being dragged out by the fierce wolves, he heard a scream. He remembered that, apart from the knights, all the others were ordinary servants. He believed that it was all because of him, and tears began to gather in his eyes. Suddenly, Carlton appeared behind him, and he put his hand over the Duke's eyes. While tears were streaming down the boy's cheeks, Carlton held him close and told him in a quiet voice not to think about anything for a moment. Carlton said that nothing that happened was the Duke's fault. Luzin then thought that the commander was right. This was no time for sentimentality. He had to act constructively. The Duke took the commander's hand from his face and intertwined their fingers. He turned his head to the man and smiled and said that he never expected him to comfort him. And then he thanked Carlton. The man smiled back and said it was his pleasure. They left the cave. The Duke walked in front, and the commander said that he would be his escort on the way back to the castle. Luzin turned and objected, saying that he had to get to the capital, so from now on he would like to move on with their knights. Carlton looked at him in surprise and asked if it would not be a better decision for him to return to the castle and regroup before setting out again. The Duke said that the castle currently had no soldiers to escort him to the capital, and that Ruver was surely waiting for him somewhere on the way back. The commander said he was able to deal with him. Luzin said he still had to arrive in the capital, but the problems he might face from there were no easier. He said that he had obligations that he had to fulfill as the High Lord of the South, so he had to get to his majesty before it was too late. Carlton asked if the king's condition had deteriorated that much. The Duke said that he did not have much time left. The young man said that preparations for the first prince's succession to the throne should have already begun, and since the Duke was one of the high lords with the power to nominate the next ruler, his presence in the capital was mandatory. The man grabbed his head and said that then they had no choice. He put his hand on his chest and said that the place where his knights were waiting was far away and they would have a difficult journey. Carlton said that they would have to travel through forests to avoid pursuit and sleep under the stars without servants to help them. The commander asked him if he was sure he would be okay. Luzin smiled and confirmed that he was used to such things. Then he turned his head away ashamedly and said that besides, Carlton was with him. The commander looked at him in surprise. The Duke then said that the man's knights would never leave him, so once they passed through the forest, they would be guaranteed an easy journey to the capital. The man's expression changed dramatically. He clearly did not want to hear that. Carlton came to the front and said that he would then scout the path to see where they should go. The commander exhaled and said that as the Duke had already proved, he was indeed a man of trust. When Luzin wanted to follow his commander, he felt a piercing pain. He looked at his shin and thought that a ferocious wolf had injured it when it dragged him along the ground. He was holding his leg and mentally telling himself that everything was fine and he could bear it. He told himself that he would no longer be a burden. Herzog ran after the commander and shouted for him to wait for him. Then the man turned his head and said that he could get hurt if he ran like that. It was already dark, and the men were standing near a cliff, when suddenly the Duke tripped over a rock and exclaimed in pain. He was catching his breath and thinking that he was exhausted because they had been walking all day without any rest. He thought about how he had been very sure that he had changed his past, but here he was again, living as a wanderer. He looked up, realizing that a person's destiny is not so easy to change. He said that we had to think, and attracted Carlton's attention. The Duke said that Rudver had suggested that they should go to the lands of the House of Dabbled, and that in a past life they had escaped at night and reached their lands. He went around saying that they were able to get there, but they stood outside the gate for a very long time. Carlton exhaled, and while Luzin was saying something, he lifted him up by the waist and looked him in the eye. Then he threw the boy on his buttocks on a rock, and he cried out in pain when he landed. Meanwhile, the commander sat down in front of him and began to take off his boots. The Duke told Carlton to wait, but he did not listen. When he took off his boot, Luzin felt a great pain that made his face twist. His exposed shin had already turned blue. Then the commander asked if the Duke had really managed to walk all the way here with such a shin. The Duke turned his face away and said that it didn't bother him, at least it didn't before Carlton pressed her. The commander put his hand behind his back and said that while he was giving the boy temporary treatment, he could eat it. He pulled out the old buried furia and said that he had come across it in those bushes. Luzin's cheeks turned red and he took the fruit in his hands and asked if he could really eat something so valuable. Carlton looked at his leg and said that he had given it to him for that very purpose. The Duke said that food really helps people regain their strength. Carlton looked at the boy's leg and thought that it must have been very painful. He wondered if he should call him stupid or praise him. The Duke smiled and stretched his arms out in different directions and said that as they walked, all his thoughts were gloomy, but now he felt he could do anything. Carlton then told Luzin to sit up straight because he couldn't concentrate. While the commander was wrapping his leg, the Duke said that Rudver was a scoundrel for stabbing him in the back. He said that this was after a generous payment for his work, and he told him to wait until he caught sight of Luzin. The commander appreciated the Duke's ardor. The man was thinking that the Duke had been betrayed by his closest servant, and that the castle would be in a tumult. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by a boy asking if he would like to join him. Carlton immediately looked up at the boy in surprise. Luzin said they could take revenge on him together. The commander smiled softly. He pulled the Duke and Furia's hand to his mouth and took a bite and said, "Of course. No one knows what the future will bring us." In his past life, the Duke had fled from Carlton's pursuers in these mountains, but now they were running away together and even swore to take revenge together. They slept in each other's arms. The Duke thought that perhaps their relationship would also take an unexpected turn. 3 days had already passed. Luzin walked behind Carlton and thought that for some reason every time he woke up he found himself in Sir Carlton's arms. The Duke wondered if he was having him in his sleep because of the cool air. When the commander climbed up on a high rock, he immediately shook hands with the Duke. He said that perhaps today they would be able to rest in better conditions. Then Luzin asked him in surprise if he had seen something. When the commander helped the boy up, Luzin looked at him in surprise. A small village was visible ahead. The Duke was very happy to see it in the distance. When they arrived there, Luzin's face immediately became frightened. Everything around them was mangled and covered in blood. They walked around looking at everything, and then Carlton said that it looked like he was attacked by monsters. He went to one of the walls and put his hand to the place where the bloody claw marks were left. The commander said that judging by the marks, it was ferocious wolves. The Duke behind him asked if it was Rudver's work. Carlton rubbed the blood between his fingers and said that judging by the dried bloodstains, it happened about 10 days ago. Luzin thought about it and said that it was a week before he was attacked. He said that Rudver was still in the castle with him. Then they came to the conclusion that in this case, the guy had accomplices. Herzog said he noticed something. He explained that there was a lot of blood, but no bodies. Carlton said there was nothing to indicate that the bodies had been moved. The commander said that perhaps the animals carried them in their mouths or ate them. Luzin was in frightened shock. Then Carlton calmly turned his head and suggested that they take what they needed for the next part of their journey and move on. He said that perhaps they would be safer in the forest. They lit a fire and lay down with a sheet and a blanket over them. They lay with their backs to each other. The Duke looked at the fire and thought that a minute ago he had felt so tired that he thought he was going to faint. Images of what he had seen in the village kept appearing before his eyes, driving him to sleep. He pulled the blanket over himself, revealing the commander. The Duke wondered if he could have prevented the tragedy if he had remembered more details of his past life. Then Carlton opened his eyes, paying attention to the movement behind him. Carlton told the Duke that he could not know everything that was happening in the world, and even if he could, it would be impossible to prepare for every eventuality. Luzin stood up abruptly and loudly asked the commander if he could read minds. The man exhaled and said that it was not so difficult to understand the Duke. The commander said that what was done, and if the Duke blamed himself, it would not change anything. He pressed the Duke to the ground with a blanket and told him to get some sleep. Carlton smiled and said that for those anxious peasants, the High Lord of the South who had reached the capital would be much more useful than this traveler sleeping under the stars. Luzin turned his head to the commander and asked if he could try to express himself a little more gently. The commander said that he did, and then asked if he was wrong. Luzin clenched the blanket in his fist and thought that perhaps Carlton was using a crude form of comfort, but it really did calm him down. His cheeks flushed. The Duke hadn't known that another person's company could be so pleasant. Carlton said that if Luzin wanted to worry about it, he could do so during the day because he had nothing better to do anyway. The Duke replied to the commander that, as he had said earlier, the boy would not think about anything. The Duke said that when he got to the capital, he would look for the survivors of that village and give them land and help them rebuild. The commander said that the village was not even in his duchy. Luzin said that he was still a High Lord of the South, so he had the right to do so. Carlton agreed and told him to do as he pleased. The Duke abruptly stopped talking, and when Carlton noticed this, he turned his head to him in surprise, addressing the boy inquiringly. He stood up and addressed him again, but not formally by name. He said that if he was so tired, he could have gone to bed earlier. The man put his hand to his forehead and thought that he should be ashamed, because his actions were only embarrassing. He recalled the moment when the Duke said he liked him. Carlton wondered why he felt happy around him. He hugged Luzin and mentally asked himself what he wanted to do with this man. The men were walking up a rocky road, and Carlton said that they were getting out of the forest slowly, so they would arrive sometime tomorrow evening. Luzin walked behind him, shuffling and asking where they were going. The commander extended his hand to the Duke for help and said that they were going to the city of Confos. Luzin thanked him and put his hand in the man's palm and spoke clearly about the city. Carlton was surprised because he did not know that the Duke knew about it. Carlton smiled as he walked hand in hand with the Duke, who dragged Rarely behind him. The commander said that because of its status as a transportation hub, it is clear why it is so prosperous, but since the city gates are open day and night, there are no checks for entry. Everything is rather chaotic. The man said that usually aristocrats don't go there because you can meet people from all walks of life there. Luzin said, smiling, that he had been there before when he was wandering around. The Duke suddenly jumped up and ran off somewhere. Carlton just looked sadly at his palm, which a few seconds ago had been the Lord's small hand. The boy took the leaflet and said that he thought he would find it here. It was a delicate leaf in the shape of a child's palm. The Duke enthusiastically said that this herb reduces fever and relieves pain. Luzin said it would definitely be useful. The commander reached for the letter and said that it was usually used by those who did not have money to pay for a doctor. Suddenly, the man touched Luzin's hand and said that he knew something that other aristocrats had no idea about. The guy abruptly withdrew his hand and said, embarrassed, that the saint sometimes gave him this to eat when it was difficult to call a doctor. The commander asked him about the saint in surprise. Then the Duke said that he was a pilgrim without a left arm and he called him a saint.